My father pointed at me across the reception floor as if he were identifying a stranger in a police lineup instead of his oldest daughter in a wedding dress. "That's her," he said. "She took the $50,000. Conversations died around us so quickly that I could hear the soft instrumental music still playing near the dance floor. My mother stepped closer to the two officers standing beside him. "Then arrest her," she said. "She stole from her own family." For a second, my body reacted before my mind did. My fingers went cold around the stem of my champagne glass. My stomach tightened under the fitted waist of my dress. Ethan moved beside me, but I touched his wrist before he could say anything. Then I looked past my parents at my younger sister. Chelsea had gone pale. "Fine," I said. "Let them search everything." Chelsea grabbed Dad's arm immediately. "This is enough. Make them leave." Dad pulled free. Chelsea stared at him, then at the officers, and something in her expression changed. She pushed through the guests and headed straight toward the valet entrance. Before I tell you how my own wedding became the night my family accused me of theft, I hope you're doing well. Stay with me because what happened after Chelsea ran outside changed everything. And if you enjoy stories like this, please subscribe to the channel and join us for the rest. One of the officers raised a hand before my mother could start talking again. He was calm, which somehow made everyone else look more ridiculous. "Nobody is being arrested right now," he said. "We received a complaint about a suspected theft from a business account. We're here to understand what happened." My mother looked offended that reality had failed to obey her. Dad was still breathing hard, his face red beneath the warm reception lights. Around us, guests were pretending not to stare while doing nothing else. I had spent months planning that room. Ivory flowers, candles, linen, music, every small detail Ethan and I had chosen together. Now 2 uniformed officers stood 10 feet from our wedding cake, while my father told them I was a criminal. I set my glass on the nearest table because my hand had started shaking, and I did not want anyone mistaking adrenaline for guilt. "What exactly am I being accused of?" I asked. The officer looked at Dad. Dad pulled a folded sheet of paper from inside his jacket with the satisfaction of a man who believed paper automatically became truth once it had been printed. $50,000 left Reed Industrial Packaging this morning," he said. "Her name is on the transaction." He thrust the page toward the officer. "She used to run finance. She knows the system better than anyone." "Used to," I said. 3 years ago." Dad looked at me. "You think that makes you innocent?" "No. I think facts make me innocent." Ethan's hand settled lightly at the middle of my back. He did not interrupt. That mattered more than I could explain at the time. My family had spent years either speaking for me or telling me when I was allowed to speak. Ethan knew better. He was there if I needed him, but he let me own the moment. The officer glanced over the sheet Dad had given him. "When was the last time you had access to this company's banking or accounting systems?" "When I resigned in 2022. My access was supposed to be terminated then." "Supposed to be?" Dad snapped. I looked at him. "That was your responsibility after I left." Mom made an irritated sound. "Samantha, do you have to talk to your father like that in front of everyone?" I nearly laughed. He had brought police officers into my wedding reception and accused me of stealing $50,000, but apparently my tone was still the family emergency. Instead, I turned back to the officer. "I'll cooperate. If you need to see my bag, my phone, or my car, I consent. I didn't take anything from that company." The officer nodded, but he did not reach for my phone or start searching through my wedding. "We don't need to turn this room upside down. Don't delete anything. Preserve your phone and any records that might be relevant. We'll take statements tonight and determine what needs to happen next." That was when Chelsea grabbed Dad's arm. "This is enough," she said. "Make them leave." Her voice was lower than Mom's, but I heard it clearly. Dad looked almost touched by her concern. "You don't have to protect her," he said. Chelsea blinked. "I'm not protecting Samantha. I'm saying this doesn't need to happen here." "It already happened here," I said. Chelsea looked at me, and for half a second I saw something I could not identify. Not anger, not exactly fear. Something closer to calculation, interrupted by panic. Then she looked toward the officers again. Dad said, "She stole from us. I'm not hiding it because she happens to be wearing a white dress." Chelsea's hand tightened around his sleeve. "Dad, please." He shook her off. Chelsea turned so abruptly that the skirt of her dress snapped against a chair. She pushed through a cluster of guests near the bar and headed for the doors leading to the hotel lobby and valet stand. People moved aside for her. Nobody stopped her. I watched her go. I did not think Chelsea stole the money. I wish I could tell you I was that brilliant in the moment. I wasn't. My thoughts were much simpler. Why did she suddenly care whether the police stayed? One of the officers followed my gaze. "Is that your sister?" "Yes." "Does she work for the company?" "Finance manager." Dad cut in immediately. "Chelsea has nothing to do with this." The officer looked at him. "I didn't say she did." Dad went quiet. That was the first moment that night when I realized my father had arrived with a conclusion, not a question. The officer asked if I was willing to look at the document Dad had brought. He held it where I could see it without handing it to me. I leaned closer. Across the top was the company name. Beneath it were transaction details, an amount of $50,000, an account reference, and a field marked initiated by Samantha Reed. For one ugly second, seeing my name there still hit me. Facts could be false and still hurt when they wore your name. Then I noticed the bottom of the page, the footer, the font, the spacing around the transaction reference. I had seen that format hundreds of times because years earlier I had helped redesign the internal accounting review templates. It was the kind of summary our own staff might generate while reconciling activity. It was not how I remembered the bank's actual treasury confirmation looking. I almost smiled. That would have been a mistake. The old version of me might have done it. She might have enjoyed watching Dad realize he had marched into my wedding, waving an internal printout he did not understand. I had a bad habit of using competence like a knife when I was angry. Sometimes I was right and still managed to make people hate the truth by the way I delivered it. Ethan must have felt the change in me because his fingers pressed gently against my back. Not now. I understood, so I kept my voice level. "Where did this come from?" Dad frowned. "The company. I understand that. Who generated it? It's right there. That isn't what I asked." Mom crossed her arms. "You always do this." "Do what?" "Turn everything into an interrogation." I looked around at the police officers standing in my reception. "That feels like an interesting complaint tonight." Ethan cleared his throat softly beside me, and I stopped there. I did not need to win every sentence. That was another lesson I had learned late. The officer looked at Dad. "Do you know who provided this document to you?" Dad hesitated just long enough for me to notice. Then the doors opened, and Chelsea came back inside. She had been gone only a few minutes. Her cheeks were flushed from the November air, and she was holding her phone. She walked toward us quickly, then slowed when she noticed everyone looking at her. "I left my phone in the car," she said. Nobody had asked. Dad seemed relieved to see her. "Chelsea, tell them." Her eyes moved toward him. "Tell them what?" "That Samantha's name was on the transfer." Chelsea glanced at me before answering. "That's what the report showed." The wording caught my attention. Not that I had transferred the money. Not that the bank said I had transferred it. The report showed it. The officer asked Chelsea for her contact information and basic role at the company. She answered carefully. He did not accuse her of anything. Nobody searched her. Nobody followed her back to the valet stand. Her trip outside was not evidence of a crime, and I knew better than to pretend it was. But I also knew my sister. Chelsea had always been good with people. She could walk into a room full of strangers and know within minutes who wanted to be admired, who wanted to be entertained, and who wanted to feel important. Where I tended to look for systems, she looked for reactions. It was one reason Dad had always said she understood people better than I did. That night, however, Chelsea was watching the officers, the way I used to watch a spreadsheet when I knew one number did not belong. Carefully, trying to figure out what they would look at next. "I really think we should handle this tomorrow," she said. "Everyone's emotional. It's Samantha's wedding. I stared at her. An hour earlier, she had barely spoken to me. Now she was defending my wedding. Dad said, "No. This has gone on long enough. Gone on long enough." I filed the words away. I did not know what he meant yet. The officers spent another 15 or 20 minutes, taking basic information and separating accusation from fact. They asked Dad when the transfer had been discovered, who had access to the relevant company accounts, whether anyone had contacted the bank, and whether the money had been recovered. Dad answered some questions confidently and others with obvious irritation. Every time he did not know something, he treated the question like an insult. My mother stood beside him with her lips pressed thin, occasionally looking toward the tables of guests, as though the real offense was that people were witnessing the consequences of her decisions. When one officer asked Dad whether he had personally confirmed with the bank that my credentials had initiated the transaction, he paused. "I have the report." That wasn't my question. I looked down so Dad would not see my expression. A few minutes later, the officers told everyone they had enough for the evening. They gave instructions about preserving records and explained that additional follow-up could happen after the bank and company information were reviewed. Nobody was arrested. Nobody was dragged away. There was no dramatic handcuffing scene for my mother to watch. Reality was slower than outrage. That ended up mattering. Once the officers began walking toward the lobby, Dad turned to me. "We need a room." I stared at him. "A private room," he said. "We need to talk as a family." "No." Mom stepped closer. "Samantha, you brought police officers into my wedding reception. We had no choice." "You had every choice." Dad lowered his voice. "Not here." I looked around the room. Guests were still pretending not to listen. My maid of honor stood near the dance floor, with tears in her eyes. One of Ethan's cousins was helping a waiter pick up a glass someone had knocked over during the commotion. The band had stopped playing completely. Dad wanted privacy now. I almost admired the nerve. "You made it public," I said. "You don't get to make it private just because it stopped going the way you expected." Mom looked horrified. "So, what are you going to do? Throw your parents out? If you stay, can you behave like guests at our wedding?" Dad stared at me. I waited. He did not answer. "Then yes," I said. "I'm asking you to leave." Mom's face crumpled in a way that would once have triggered every older sister instinct in me. Fix it. Soften it. Give them an exit that lets everyone pretend nothing happened. I did not. Chelsea stood a few feet behind them, silent. Dad looked at Ethan. "Are you going to let her do this?" Ethan finally stepped forward. "This is her family," he said. "She doesn't need my permission to set a boundary with them." Dad gave a bitter laugh. "You don't know what you married into." Ethan looked at him calmly. "I'm getting a clearer picture." Dad turned and walked away. Mom followed after one last wounded look at me, the kind that suggested I had somehow ruined her evening. Chelsea stayed where she was for another few seconds. "I'm sorry this happened tonight," she said. I studied her face. "Are you?" Her jaw tightened. "That's not fair." "No," I said. "Tonight really isn't." She looked toward the lobby where our parents had disappeared. "You know, Dad, once he decides something, nobody can stop him." That sentence stayed with me too. At the time, I heard it as criticism of our father. Later, I would hear something else inside it. Chelsea left without hugging me. For several minutes after they were gone, I stood in the middle of my own reception, without knowing what came next. There is no wedding planning checklist for what to do after your father accuses you of felony theft between dinner and the first dance. Ethan came to me. "We can end this." I looked around. Some guests had already slipped out. I did not blame them. Others remained in awkward groups, clearly unsure whether staying was supportive or intrusive. The cake was still untouched. Our bandleader stood near the stage, waiting for instructions. A part of me wanted to leave. Not because I was ashamed, because suddenly everything in the room felt contaminated. Months of planning had been reduced to one image I knew people would remember. Samantha's wedding? Wasn't that the one where the police came? Then I looked at Ethan. He had spent the entire confrontation letting me make my own decisions. I was not going to let my parents make this one either. I don't want the whole reception, I said. I can't pretend nothing happened. We don't have to. But I want our dance. His expression softened. And I want to cut the cake, I added. Because I paid too much for that cake to let my father ruin it. Ethan laughed for the first time all evening. That helped. So we stayed. Not until midnight. Not for every planned toast or every song. We did not perform happiness for people. But Ethan and I had our first dance. I remember resting my cheek against his shoulder and realizing my body was still tight from the confrontation. He did not tell me to relax. He just held me until eventually I did. We cut the cake. I thanked the guests who stayed. I hugged the friends who knew not to ask questions that night. And when I finally changed out of my wedding shoes, my feet hurt so badly that the physical pain almost felt comforting. It was ordinary, manageable. A blister had a cause I could understand. My family did not. I thought the worst part of that evening had already happened. I was wrong. Before Dad left the hotel completely, one of the officers caught him near the lobby. Ethan and I were close enough to hear part of the exchange because we were speaking with the venue coordinator near the entrance. The officer had the printed transaction summary in his hand. "Sir, one last question," he said. "You said this came from your company. Who specifically pulled this report?" Dad looked irritated. Then he looked at Chelsea. She had been standing several feet away with her coat folded over one arm. That hesitation was tiny, maybe 2 seconds. But after the night I had just survived, I had stopped wasting small details. "Chelsea pulled it from the system," Dad said. My sister turned sharply toward him. "I printed what the system showed." Dad frowned. "You gave it to me." "I said I printed it." The officer looked from one of them to the other, then wrote something down. Nobody shouted. Nobody confessed. There was no dramatic revelation. Just one question and 2 slightly different answers. But something inside me settled into place. For hours, I had been asking myself why Chelsea wanted the police gone. Why she had grabbed Dad's arm. Why she had rushed toward the valet the moment I offered to cooperate. Why a woman who supposedly believed I had stolen $50,000 suddenly wanted everything handled quietly. I had been asking the wrong question. The first question should have been much simpler. Who put my name on the page? My father had spent the whole night accusing me because of a document he believed proved I was a thief. And Chelsea was the one who had handed him the proof. By the time Ethan and I reached our hotel room, I had stopped feeling like a bride. My dress was still on, my hair was still pinned, and there were tiny pearls sewn along my sleeves that caught the light every time I moved. None of it felt connected to me anymore. I kicked off my shoes near the door, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at my phone while Ethan loosened his tie. For almost a full minute, neither of us spoke. Then he asked, "What do you want to do first? Call an attorney? Call the detective? Call your father back?" I shook my head. "I want to make sure nobody can say I changed anything." Ethan studied me for a moment, then said the one thing I did not want to hear. "Sam, you don't work there anymore." "I know. Do you?" I looked up at him. He was not accusing me. He knew me too well for that. Whenever something broke, my first instinct was to reach for it. I had spent most of my adult life believing competence created responsibility. If I knew how to solve a problem, I felt almost morally obligated to solve it, even when the problem belonged to someone else. That habit had made me useful. It had also made me exhausted. "I'm not logging into anything," I said. "I'm not touching their systems. I just want my own records." That was different, and Ethan knew it. I opened my personal email and searched for messages from the year I left Reed Industrial Packaging. I found the separation email confirming my last day, a benefits notice, and an old message acknowledging the return of company property. I saved copies to a folder and backed them up. I did not know yet whether any of it would matter. I only knew that if my father was going to accuse me of using access I had surrendered 3 years earlier, I wanted the exact dates in front of me. That was the thing about my family. Dates mattered to me. Systems mattered. Paper trails mattered. To my father, those things had always been signs that I did not trust people enough. 3 years earlier, I had been the controller at Reed Industrial Packaging, the company Dad had built from a small warehouse operation into a regional distributor with dozens of employees. He understood sales, vendors, negotiation, and people. He could walk into a room with an angry customer and leave 20 minutes later with a handshake and another order. I respected that about him. What he never respected about me was that a company could not run forever on instinct and goodwill. In 2022, I began tightening some of the financial procedures that had grown sloppy as the business expanded. Vendor accounts had been created without consistent secondary approval. Accounting passwords were being shared because someone was out sick or because Dad wanted an invoice entered before lunch. The treasury system used hardware authentication keys for certain banking functions, and more than once I had found one sitting in an unlocked desk drawer. None of those things meant anyone was stealing. They meant that if someone ever did, we would have trouble proving who had done what. I remember sitting at the conference table one afternoon with a row of authentication keys in front of me. I had assigned each one a serial number, documented who was supposed to hold it, and created a log for returns and reassignments. Chelsea walked in carrying an iced coffee and stared at the labels. "Do you inventory Dad's coffee mugs too?" she asked. "Only the ones that can authorize bank transactions," she laughed. "You know, normal families just trust each other." Before I could answer, Dad came through the doorway and looked at the table. "What is all this?" "K-Control." His expression changed immediately. "Samantha, what?" "We're a family, not a bank." "We use a bank." "That's not what I mean." "I know exactly what you mean." That was how most of our arguments started. He believed I was making simple things complicated. I believed he was treating complicated things as simple because that was more comfortable. The worst part was that neither of us was completely wrong. Dad had built the company without a finance degree or a stack of policy manuals. He had survived downturns, difficult clients, and supply problems through judgment and relationships. But by then, Reed was no longer a small company where 5 people sat within shouting distance of each other. We had around 50 employees, a revolving credit line, multiple vendor systems, company cards, remote access, and millions of dollars moving through the business each year. "Trust me" was not an internal control. Chelsea hated those conversations. At least, that was how I interpreted her reactions at the time. She would lean back in her chair and roll her eyes while Dad and I argued over procedure, as if both of us were making a simple day harder than it needed to be. She was better at smoothing things over. She knew when to joke, when to change the subject, and when to give Dad exactly enough agreement to make him feel heard. I was better at being right. That distinction mattered more than I understood then. Around that same time, Chelsea launched Hearth and Veil. She had spent months building it quietly before showing the family. It was an online home decor business with carefully photographed candles, woven baskets, ceramic planters, throw blankets, and imported kitchen pieces. She had a polished website, professional branding, samples spread across Mom and Dad's dining room, and a presentation about where she wanted the company to go. Mom was thrilled. Dad was impressed. Chelsea stood beside a display table glowing with pride while she explained her launch plan. I asked about margins. Chelsea's smile tightened a little. "I knew you would." She showed me her projections. I remember looking at the numbers and immediately seeing what worried me. Shipping costs were high, customer acquisition was expensive. She had underestimated returns. Some of the products had long lead times, and she was counting heavily on sales growth to absorb costs that were already rising. I could have said, "These numbers need work." I could have said, "Let me help you model a bad quarter." Instead, I looked at my sister in front of our parents and said, "That isn't a business yet. It's an expensive hobby with a logo." The room went silent. Chelsea smiled. That smile bothered me more now than anger would have. She gave a tiny laugh and said, "Thanks, Sam. Glad I asked." Dad told me I did not have to tear everything apart, just because I understood spreadsheets. Mom changed the subject. I told myself everyone was being emotional because I had said something true. Years later, I could admit the more uncomfortable truth. I had been right about the financial risk and cruel about the person taking it. Those were not mutually exclusive. That did not make me responsible for what Chelsea eventually did. Nothing I said at that dining table justified theft, fraud, or framing me. But if I was going to tell this story honestly, I could not turn myself into the flawless older sister surrounded by irrational people. I had sharp edges. I knew where people were vulnerable. And when I felt dismissed, I sometimes used facts to cut. Chelsea remembered being cut. The fight that finally pushed me out of Reed happened months later. By then, my concern was no longer one key or one shared password. It was the pattern. Too many people had access they did not need. Vendor setup was too easy. Old users were not always removed quickly. Dad hated delays, so employees had learned that the fastest way to please him was to work around whatever process slowed them down. I wrote a controls memo. It was not dramatic. It was not an accusation. I listed the weaknesses I had found and proposed straightforward changes. No shared application passwords. 2-person approval for new vendors. Immediate removal of inactive user access. A documented hardware key log. Stronger separation between the person entering a vendor and the person approving payment. Dad responded by email. Too much red tape. Use judgment. I can still remember staring at those words. I walked into his office with a printed copy of my memo. Judgment is not a control. He leaned back in his chair. There you go again. Again what? Talking like everyone here is trying to steal from me. I'm talking like someone eventually might. This company ran for years before you showed up with a checklist. I did not show up. I grew up here. And now you think you know better than everyone who built it. That hurt because it was not entirely about work anymore. I said, if you want me responsible for the numbers, then I need the authority to protect them. You have authority. No, I have responsibility. There's a difference. He looked at me for a long time. Maybe the problem is that you don't know how to work with family. I should have walked out then. Instead, I said, maybe the problem is that you use the word family every time you want someone to ignore a risk. That was the beginning of the end. I did not quit that afternoon, but something broke between us. Within months, I resigned. I documented my transition, trained the people who needed training, returned company equipment, surrendered my banking access, and signed off on the hardware assigned to me. I told myself I was leaving a job. Dad treated it like I was leaving him. Chelsea stayed. At first, I thought that made things easier for everyone. She took on more finance responsibilities because she was already involved in operations and vendor relationships. Dad praised her for stepping up. Mom told friends how Chelsea had become the one who could keep everything moving without turning every problem into a policy meeting. Yet even after I left, Dad still compared us. If an invoice was coded wrong, he would say, Samantha would have caught that. If someone missed a reconciliation issue, he would ask why nobody had noticed it earlier. Sometimes Chelsea told me about those comments herself. Other times Mom did, usually while trying to convince me to come to Sunday dinner. You know your father, Mom would say. He misses having you there. That is not the same as respecting me. You're the older one, Samantha. Don't make this harder. That sentence had followed me most of my life. You're the older one. Be patient. Be reasonable. Let it go. Chelsea is sensitive. Dad is stubborn. Mom is stressed. Somehow, everyone else got a personality, and I got an assignment. Dad had another phrase I heard often after Chelsea took on more responsibility. He would text her when he was traveling or buried in sales meetings and say, "Whatever you need for the business." At the time, nobody thought much about it. He meant call the vendor, approve the shipment, move the schedule, handle staffing, solve the problem. Dad gave broad instructions because that was how he managed people he trusted. Chelsea had more operational freedom than I ever would have accepted without documentation, but that did not mean he was handing her permission to use company money for anything she wanted. I did not know yet how important those vague words would become. Lying in that hotel bed after my wedding, though, I was not thinking about Chelsea's business or Dad's management style. I was thinking about hardware. Ethan had fallen asleep sometime after 3 a.m. I had not. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Dad pointing at me in front of our guests. Then I saw the printed report, my name sitting neatly beside a transaction I had never made. A little after 7, I got out of bed and made coffee with the machine near the window. Columbus looked gray outside, the kind of November morning when everything seemed damp even when it was not raining. My wedding dress was hanging over a chair where Ethan had carefully placed it before we slept. I looked at it and felt a wave of anger so sharp that I had to turn away. I opened my laptop again. Not the company's laptop, mine. I searched my personal email for the final offboarding correspondence from Reed. One message came from the office administrator the week after my departure. It confirmed the items I had returned. Laptop, building badge, company credit card, hardware authentication key. Attached was the signed return checklist. I stared at the line for the key. Returned. Date recorded. My signature. Company acknowledgement. The memory came back immediately. I had placed the small device on the conference table during my final day and watched the administrator check it against the list. I had insisted on documenting the return because that was exactly the kind of person I was. For once, being obsessive felt wonderful. Ethan woke while I was still staring at the screen. "You found something." "I found proof I gave back my key." He sat up. "Does that prove you didn't transfer the money?" "No." That answer surprised him. I turned the laptop toward him. "It proves I surrendered the device assigned to me 3 years ago. I still don't know how the bank transaction was authorized. I don't know whether another key could be reassigned. I don't know what the bank logs say. And I'm not going to pretend I know because I want to be right." He looked at me for a few seconds, then smiled faintly. That sounded painful. It was. I sent a message to the detective contact we had been given the night before and said I had found my offboarding confirmation and could provide it if useful. He replied later that morning asking me to preserve the original email and forward a copy. I did exactly that. I did not call anyone at Reed. I did not ask an old employee to sneak me records. I did not try to log into any system I no longer had permission to use. Then I sat at the little hotel desk with a cup of terrible coffee and finally allowed myself to think through what I actually knew. My old banking access had been surrendered. My hardware key had been returned. The report Dad carried into my wedding claimed a transaction had been initiated under my name. Chelsea had printed that report. Those facts did not tell me who had moved the money. They did not tell me why. They did not prove my sister had stolen anything. But they changed the shape of the problem. The night before, I had been defending myself against a document. Now I was beginning to question the document itself. 3 years earlier, I had left Reed believing I could walk away from the company's broken controls because they were no longer my responsibility. Sitting there the morning after my wedding, I realized one of those old weaknesses had somehow followed me all the way into my new life. My access had been shut down. My key had been returned. Whatever that piece of paper said, one thing was suddenly clear. Somebody had not found my name in the system. Somebody had put it there. By Monday morning, the wedding felt farther away than 3 days. Ethan and I were back home, our unopened honeymoon luggage still sitting in the guest room, because neither of us had been able to look at it without thinking about everything that had replaced the trip we were supposed to be taking. I had slept badly, eaten almost nothing, and checked my phone often enough that Ethan finally took it out of my hand while I was standing in the kitchen. "If someone calls, you'll hear it," he said. "Staring at the screen won't make them call faster." I knew he was right, which irritated me more than if he had been wrong. What I wanted was simple. I wanted someone official to call my father and say he had accused the wrong person. I wanted every guest who had watched him point at me to know that the paper in his hand was worthless. I wanted certainty delivered with the same speed as humiliation. The detective called shortly after 10. I stood so quickly that my chair scraped across the floor. Ethan remained across the kitchen island, watching me while I answered. The detective did not waste time. Preliminary information from the bank and the company did not show that my closed credentials had authorized the $50,000 transaction. My old access appeared inactive. Nothing they had reviewed so far supported the claim that I had logged into the Treasury system and sent the money. For a few seconds, I said nothing. Relief came first, warm and sudden enough to make my knees feel weak. Then anger rushed in behind it. "So I'm cleared. That isn't exactly what I said. My jaw tightened. You just said my credentials weren't used. I said what we've received so far does not show your closed credentials authorizing the transaction. That means we currently have no basis to treat you as the person who initiated it. We're still reviewing how the transaction was approved and where the report your father brought came from. I wanted a cleaner sentence. I wanted him to say, Samantha Reed did not steal the money. Instead, he gave me process. What do I tell the people who watched my parents accuse me at my wedding? There was a pause before he answered. Tell them the investigation is ongoing and there is no evidence at this point that you authorized that transfer. It was accurate. I hated it. After the call ended, I put my phone on the counter harder than necessary. Ethan poured more coffee into his mug. That's good news, he said. It's partial news. It's still good. My father stood in front of everyone and said I took $50,000. Mom demanded I be arrested. I should not have to wait weeks for a sentence with 17 qualifiers attached to it. Ethan leaned against the counter. You don't have to like the pace. I don't. But their job isn't to repair what your parents did to you. Their job is to figure out what happened. I stared at him. He added, and you know that. I did. That was the frustrating part. At Reed, I had spent years telling people not to jump from suspicious numbers to conclusions. Verify the source. Reconstruct the sequence. Separate what you know from what you think happened. Now that I was the person being accused, I wanted everyone else to skip those steps because I already knew I was innocent. I took a breath and sat back down. Fine, I said. I'll be patient. Ethan smiled. That sounded threatening. It was. Later that day, I received a call from a woman named Melissa Grant. She explained that Reed's attorney had retained her to conduct an independent financial review after the banking credential problem surfaced. She was not calling to tell me what the company had found. She wanted to interview me about procedures that existed when I worked there. That distinction mattered. Melissa did not invite me into a conference room full of records I had no right to see. She did not give me passwords or let me scroll through company accounts. We spoke by video call, with company counsel joining for part of it, and she asked narrow questions. How were treasury users assigned when I was controller? What happened when employees left? Who controlled the hardware authentication devices? Could one person create a vendor and approve a payment? Had the company maintained records of device assignments? I answered only what I actually knew. We had a serial log for the hardware keys, I told her. Melissa looked down at her notes. Do you have a copy? No. I created the process, but the current log belongs to Reed. I don't have company files. Where would it have been stored? I described the finance directory structure that existed 3 years earlier, and the physical binder we had kept as backup. I warned her that I could not guarantee either location was still being used. You returned your own device? Yes. I already provided the offboarding email and signed return checklist to the detective. Do you remember the serial number? No. That answer bothered me because I remembered almost everything else about that system. But I refused to guess. A wrong serial number spoken confidently would be worse than saying I did not remember. Melissa asked about the transaction summary Dad had brought to the wedding. I recognized the format, I said. At least I thought I did. What did you think it was? An internal review template. Something accounting might generate while reconciling activity. It didn't look like the bank confirmation format I remembered. Did you create that template? I helped redesign an older version. That was years ago. Could someone edit it? Yes. It was a working document, not a locked bank record. Melissa nodded but did not react beyond that. I wanted to ask whether she had already confirmed it. I didn't. Her job was to establish facts, not satisfy me. Before the call ended, she said, We're retrieving archived control records and system documentation directly from the company. If I need you to identify a historical process later, I'll contact you. That's it? For today, I almost asked her to tell me whether Chelsea had been interviewed. Instead, I stopped myself. Afterward, I told Ethan I felt as though someone had placed the answer to a test on the other side of a glass wall. You know what your problem is? He asked. I assume you're about to tell me. You spent years being the person who had access to the records. Now you're just a witness. Just a witness sounds insulting. It isn't. It feels insulting. He laughed, and for the first time since the wedding, I laughed too. 2 days later, the detective called again. This time he had something more concrete. The document Dad brought to the wedding had not come from the bank. Company information technology staff had identified it as an editable internal transaction review template. The bank's own confirmation records did not contain an "initiated by Samantha Reed" field, matching the printout my father had waved in front of everyone. I walked slowly from my office into the hallway while I listened. So someone edited it. We know the document itself was editable. We are still determining who entered specific information and when. Chelsea said she printed what the system showed. I'm aware. Does the system generate that exact document? That's one of the questions being reviewed. Again, process. Again, restraint. But this time I did not fight him. At the wedding, I had noticed the footer and spacing because they were familiar. Now the official review had confirmed my instinct. Dad had not arrived carrying proof from a bank. He had arrived carrying an internal document that could be changed. Someone had typed my name into a field. That did not yet tell me who. But it destroyed the certainty my father had used to justify what he did. I called him that evening. I probably should not have. Company counsel would have preferred everyone communicate carefully while the review was underway. But there are things an investigator can establish that a daughter still needs to hear from her father. Dad answered after the 4th ring. What? No hello. No apology, I said. The report you brought to my wedding wasn't a bank confirmation. Silence. Then, I know they're reviewing it. Did you know that Friday? No. Did you verify it with the bank before calling police? I had a transaction report with your name on it. That isn't an answer. His voice sharpened. Given what I saw, what was I supposed to think? Verify it before bringing police to my wedding. I was trying to protect my company. You accused your daughter of theft in front of a room full of people based on a document you didn't verify. There was $50,000 missing. And somehow that made my name automatically believable. You knew the systems. I hadn't worked there in 3 years. You left angry. There it was. Not banking. Not evidence. Resentment. I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes. So that was enough for you? Dad exhaled hard. Chelsea said the report showed your user. What did you expect me to do? I opened my eyes. Chelsea told you to call the police? There was another silence. A different one this time. No. I straightened. What? She said we should wait. I said nothing. Dad sounded annoyed that I had forced the detail out of him. She wanted to talk to you first. I told her that was stupid. When was this? Friday afternoon. Before you came to the hotel? Yes. What exactly did she say? That we shouldn't warn you until we knew what happened. That is not the same thing as wanting to talk to me. She said we could handle it without making a scene. My pulse changed. I remembered Chelsea at the reception grabbing Dad's arm. This is enough. Make them leave. At the time, I had assumed that reaction meant she feared the police. Now I had something more than an assumption. You decided to call them anyway. Of course I did. If you'd done it and I warned you first, you could have deleted records. I actually laughed. Not because anything was funny, because the arrogance of it was almost elegant. So, Chelsea told you not to call police, and you thought that meant she was being too soft on me. She was trying to keep the family from turning into a circus. You turned my wedding into the circus. Dad ignored that. Chelsea has always tried to hold this family together. I looked toward the living room where Ethan was reading on the couch. Who gave you the report? You already know that. Say it. Chelsea printed it. Does Chelsea normally have access to Treasury information? She helps me all the time. What does that mean? It means she handles things when I'm traveling. Payments, vendors, whatever needs to get done. Does she use your authentication key? Dad hesitated. Sometimes. I shut my eyes again. That answer did not prove Chelsea stole anything. Dad had legitimately allowed her to help him. If his credential appeared in the banking record, there could be innocent explanations for possession and access, but it explained something important. Chelsea was not an outsider looking at a system she barely understood. She knew how Dad worked. She knew what he delegated. She knew what he ignored. And now I had confirmation that the police spectacle had gone further than she had asked him to go. I could reasonably believe Chelsea had not expected uniformed officers at my reception. What I could not do was pretend I knew why. Maybe she really had wanted to spare me. Maybe she thought Dad was moving too quickly. Maybe she feared embarrassment. Maybe she knew more. I would have loved to choose the last answer immediately. Instead, I forced myself to stop. Facts first. That Friday, Melissa's review formally widened. I learned this through company counsel and the detective. Not because anyone suddenly invited me back into Reed's systems. The bank had reset affected treasury credentials and preserved authentication records. Reed's lender had also asked for an independent review because the company relied on a revolving line of credit, and a financial institution lending millions to a business did not care that Robert Reed trusted his daughters. They cared whether the company could prove who controlled its money. Melissa called me once more to clarify where archived key records might exist. She had found evidence that the serial log had survived in company records, but she did not give me its contents. She only asked how assignments had originally been documented. You understand I can't share investigative conclusions with you just because you designed the old process, she said. I know. You sound disappointed. I'm working on personal growth. That earned a small laugh. Then she said something I remembered. My rule in reviews like this is simple. No family narratives. No one is the good daughter, the difficult daughter, the trusted employee, or the misunderstood one. I want records and timelines. I liked her immediately. By Friday afternoon, I thought I understood the shape of the first victory. My old user had not authorized the transfer. The accusation against me had relied on an editable internal summary rather than official bank confirmation. Dad had escalated the matter to police even after Chelsea told him to wait. For the first time since the wedding, I could breathe without feeling that invisible accusation pressed against my chest. Then the detective called again. We've confirmed the destination of the $50,000 payment, he said. He sat down at my desk. Chelsea? No. That answer caught me off guard. Who? He gave me the name of a packaging and freight supplier. At first, it meant nothing. Then my memory caught up. I had seen that name before. Years earlier, when Chelsea was launching Hearth and Veil, she had brought samples into my parents' dining room and talked about imported ceramics, shipping damage, custom boxes, and freight costs. I had warned her that logistics were eating her margins alive. That supplier had handled a large part of her early inventory. I asked the detective whether Reed Industrial Packaging had a legitimate reason to pay them. We're still determining that. I did not say Chelsea's name. I did not celebrate. A supplier could serve more than one business. Payments could be miscoded. Companies sometimes paid the wrong invoice and corrected it later. I had spent too many years in finance to confuse suspicious with proven. But the question had changed again. The money had not gone into Chelsea's bank account. It had gone somewhere worse for her story. To a company I knew had once shipped half of Hearth and Veil's inventory. The first thing Melissa made me understand was that $50,000 had not appeared out of nowhere. About a week after we learned where the payment had gone, she called to ask whether I remembered how Reed Industrial Packaging had historically dealt with that supplier. I told her what I could. They handled packaging materials, freight coordination, and some warehouse-related services. Reed had used them occasionally. Hearth and Veil had used them too, especially around Chelsea's early launches. That overlap was exactly why I had refused to call the payment proof of theft when I first heard the supplier's name. Melissa agreed. Then she told me something that made the timing of the transfer make sense. Hearth and Veil had owed that supplier almost $50,000. The account had been past due long enough that the supplier had given Chelsea a firm Friday deadline. If payment did not arrive, an incoming shipment would be held, and the account could be pushed toward collections. Friday was my wedding day. For several days after the reception, I had been asking why anyone would choose that particular morning to move such a large amount of money. The answer was much less theatrical than I had imagined. The calendar had chosen the day. Chelsea had not needed $50,000 because she wanted to ruin my wedding. She had needed it because one of her vendors wanted to be paid before the weekend. That actually made the situation more believable. It also made it more dangerous. According to the explanation Chelsea was giving through the company's attorney, the payment had been misapplied between two businesses that happened to use the same vendor. She said Reed had paid an invoice connected to Hearth and Veil by mistake. She intended to correct the problem after the weekend. The timing was awful. The paperwork was sloppy. But it was not theft. If I had heard that explanation about two companies that were not owned by sisters, I would not have dismissed it immediately. That was what irritated me most. There were legitimate reasons for related businesses, shared vendors, and similar expense categories to create confusion. Reed bought cartons, packing material, freight, and warehouse services. Hearth and Veil bought cartons, packing material, freight, and warehouse services. A description like shipping or packaging on a ledger did not automatically tell you whose shipment had benefited. Melissa said, "Motive can tell us where to look. It cannot tell us what happened." I told her I knew, and she asked, "Do you?" I hated that question because by then I was beginning to realize the answer was not always yes. The public version of Hearth and Veil had always looked beautiful. Even after I stopped following Chelsea closely, it was difficult to miss. Mom shared almost every product launch. Relatives reposted holiday collections. Chelsea had professional photographs of pale ceramic vases arranged beside linen napkins, candles glowing against reclaimed wood, baskets displayed in bright kitchens that probably cost more to rent for a photo shoot than some people spent on groceries in a month. There were launch dinners, branded boxes, influencer posts, and pictures of Chelsea standing inside a warehouse with captions about building something from nothing. Dad loved those pictures. He would forward them in the family group chat and write things like, "Proud of you, kiddo." Sometimes he would add, "Whatever you need for the business, you know where I am." At the time, I had never interpreted that sentence as anything more than Dad being Dad. He told employees similar things. If a sales manager called because a shipment was late, Dad would say, "Do whatever you need to do." If Chelsea was dealing with a vendor, he would tell her, "Whatever you need for the business." His language was broad because his management style was broad. Years later, that casual phrase would matter. In November, it just sounded like something a father said to a daughter he trusted. What I learned from Melissa over the next several weeks was that Hearth and Veil's polished image had almost nothing to do with its cash position. I did not receive every balance sheet or private record. I was not entitled to them. But because the $50,000 payment had landed at one of Chelsea's suppliers, the review had to establish whether Reed had a legitimate obligation there. That meant Melissa eventually explained enough of the surrounding facts for me to understand the pressure Chelsea had been under. Hearth and Veil had too much inventory. Returns were higher than Chelsea had projected. Online advertising had become expensive enough that some sales barely covered the cost of acquiring the customer. Warehouse charges kept coming even when merchandise sat still. Several suppliers had tightened payment terms. Chelsea had also used personal credit to keep things moving and delayed certain vendor payments as long as she could. She had not been sitting on some hidden fortune. She had been buying time. I remember standing in my home office after one of those calls and looking at an old photograph Mom had sent the family months earlier. Chelsea was standing beside stacked Hearth and Veil boxes, smiling with both arms spread as though the warehouse behind her represented growth. At the time the picture had been taken, she had already been struggling to pay for some of what was sitting there. That did not make me happy. I wish I could say my first reaction was sympathy. It wasn't. My first reaction was vindication. I remembered the dining room years earlier when I had looked at her projections and called Hearth and Veil an expensive hobby with a logo. I remembered Dad telling me I always had to tear things apart. I remembered Chelsea smiling as though I were just the bitter older sister who could not stand watching her build something. Now the numbers were doing exactly what I had warned they might do. There was a dark, ugly part of me that wanted to send Dad every fact Melissa had mentioned and write 3 words. "I told you. I did something almost that bad." Melissa had specifically warned me not to turn financial pressure into an accusation. She was still reviewing why Reed had paid that invoice. who had authorized it, and what supporting documentation existed. I knew that. Then Dad texted me. He had barely spoken to me since our phone call, but that afternoon he wrote, "Chelsea says you are telling people she stole from the company. Stop spreading things you cannot prove." I stared at the message until my face felt hot. I had not been calling relatives. I had not posted anything online. I had told Ethan, my attorney, and people directly involved in the review what I knew, but the accusation touched the exact place in me that still wanted my father to admit how badly he had misjudged me. I typed back before I cooled down. "I'm not the one who used your company as a bank." I sent it. It felt wonderful for about 30 seconds. Then my phone rang. Chelsea. I considered ignoring her. Instead, I answered. "You really couldn't wait, could you?" she said. I asked what she meant, and she said, "To make this about you being right." I told her she had put my name on a report. She shot back that I did not know who had put anything anywhere. I said I knew Reed had paid her supplier $50,000 on the exact day her account was about to be locked down. She insisted it was a vendor allocation problem involving company money and that it was being corrected. When I laughed and called the timing convenient, her voice changed. "You have been waiting for Hearth and Vale to fail since the day I showed it to the family," she said. I denied it, but she reminded me exactly what I had said years earlier. "You called it an expensive hobby with a logo." I went quiet, but Chelsea did not. "You said it in front of Mom and Dad. You looked at something I had built and decided it was a joke because it didn't work the way you thought it should. I said your numbers were dangerous. No, you humiliated me. That does not explain $50,000 leaving Reed. I didn't say it did. I'm saying you want this to be criminal because then you get to be right about me forever." I felt my anger harden. "You know what, Chelsea? If you didn't want anyone questioning where the money went, maybe Reed shouldn't have paid one of your overdue bills." She was silent for a moment before she said, "There it is." "What?" "The thing you always do. You decide the answer before everyone else finishes asking the question." That landed harder than I wanted it to. Not because I thought Chelsea was innocent, but because I had accused Dad in writing of letting her use the company as a bank before the review had proven that was what happened. Chelsea hung up first. By dinner, 3 relatives had texted me. One cousin asked whether I was really trying to shut down Chelsea's company. An aunt told me family disputes did not belong with investigators and attorneys. Another relative sent a longer message saying she understood why I was angry about the wedding but hoped I was not using my financial background to bury Chelsea because of old resentment. I knew exactly where the language had come from. Chelsea had started telling her version. She did not have to say I was lying. She only had to tell people something true. Samantha always hated Hearth and Vale. Samantha said it would fail. Samantha thinks she knows more than everyone else. All of those things contained enough truth to make the rest easier to believe. That was my first real setback. Not because the investigation changed, but because I had handed Chelsea a defense she could use outside it. When Ethan came home that evening, he found me sitting at the dining table with my laptop open, 3 windows of notes in front of me, and my phone buzzing beside my elbow. He put his keys down and asked if I had eaten. I said I was not hungry. He pointed out that was not what he had asked, and I told him I would eat later. He stood behind my chair and asked how long I had been sitting there. When I said I did not know, he said that meant all day. I looked up at him. There was no accusation in his voice, but I heard one anyway. "Sorry my family accused me of stealing $50,000 3 days after we got married." That is not what I said. It sounded like it. It sounded like I asked how long you've been sitting here. I pushed the laptop back. "Fine. A long time." Ethan pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. "We canceled our honeymoon." Delayed. "I didn't ask you to cancel it." "No. We agreed to delay it because your wedding turned into a police complaint, and neither of us felt like getting on a plane while you were being interviewed." "Exactly. And now they don't have evidence that you authorized the transfer. They're still reviewing it." "I know. Then what are we arguing about?" He was quiet for a few seconds before he said, We are arguing because you keep saying you are doing all of this to clear your name. That is what I'm doing. No. I stared at him. Ethan continued carefully. Your name is being cleared. The report doesn't match the bank record. Your old access was closed. The detective isn't treating you like the person who sent the money. What you are doing now is something else. My chest tightened. What? You're trying to make sure your father admits you were right. I stood up. That's insulting. It isn't meant to be. He brought police to our wedding. He told a room full of people I stole from him. And now I find out the money went to Chelsea's supplier, her business is drowning, and you think I should stop asking questions? I did not say stop. Then what are you saying? I'm saying you're not the investigator. I looked away. He softened his voice. And you're not Reed's controller anymore. That sentence still had the power to make me feel as though something had been taken away, even though I was the one who had resigned. I told him I knew that, and he asked me to let Melissa do her job. When I asked what I was supposed to do, he looked around our dining room and reminded me that we had gotten married 2 weeks earlier. That hurt, not because he was blaming me, but because I had almost forgotten how recently it had happened. The gifts were still stacked unopened in the spare room. Our cards were still sitting in a basket on the kitchen counter. There was a bottle of champagne someone had given us that we had never opened. Every time my phone rang, I moved deeper into the crisis my parents had brought to our reception, and Ethan followed because he loved me. I had turned our first weeks of marriage into an extension of the investigation. I don't know how to just leave it alone, I said. I'm not asking you to leave it alone. It feels like you are. I'm asking you not to let them decide what our marriage looks like, too. I sat down again. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan reached across the table and closed my laptop. I let him. That was harder than it sounds. The next morning, I sent Melissa a short message apologizing if anything I had said to my family created noise around the review. She replied that family noise was not her concern as long as nobody altered records or interfered with employees. Then she added one sentence, "Do not confuse a compelling theory with a completed test." I printed that line and taped it beside my monitor, mostly because it annoyed me. For several days, nothing dramatic happened. That was another part of the story people tend to forget when they hear the final version. Real financial investigations contain long stretches where nobody screams, nobody confesses, and nobody discovers a folder labeled evidence. People compare invoices, they confirm dates, they follow addresses. They ask why one business paid for something another business received. Sometimes the most important discovery is a boring payment made 8 months earlier. Melissa called me near the end of November. She wanted to confirm whether Reed had historically done regular business with the supplier that received the $50,000. I told her yes, occasionally. She asked whether a freight or packaging charge from them would have looked unusual on Reed's ledger. I said no. Then she asked whether I would have needed the invoice detail to know which business benefited. I said yes. That was the problem. A payment to a familiar supplier could hide in plain sight because the vendor itself was legitimate. Melissa told me the review had found an older payment to the same supplier. It was much smaller than $50,000 and had been made months earlier. Reed's ledger described it as ordinary freight and packaging expense. When I asked whether that proved it belonged to Hearth and Vale, she said no. I was learning. Instead, I asked what it proved. That we have another transaction worth checking, she said. Chelsea's explanation, as it came back through company counsel, was predictable and not completely ridiculous. Both companies used the vendor. Accounts could be miscoded. Someone might have attached the wrong customer reference. 2 mistakes did not automatically become a fraud scheme. I wanted to argue, but instead I asked where the shipment had gone. Melissa said they were still confirming it. A few days later, she called again. The first older transaction did not give her enough to make a conclusion, but during the look-back, her team had found another payment. Different vendor. Different amount. The accounting description still looked ordinary for Reed. Freight, warehouse handling, packaging-related service. Only this time, there was a shipping address attached to the supporting documentation. I knew the address. I had been there once when Chelsea first launched Hearth and Veil. It was not Reed's warehouse. It was the facility where Hearth and Veil stored inventory. For the first time, I let myself sit completely still after Melissa stopped speaking. "How much?" I asked. "We're not giving you a total yet. You have more." "I didn't say that. You didn't have to, Samantha." I closed my eyes. "Theory, test. Theory, test. I know," Melissa continued. "A payment can be coded incorrectly. A shipping address can be entered incorrectly. We have to establish what service was performed, who requested it, who approved it, and which business actually benefited." "But you're widening the review." "Yes." "How far?" She did not answer immediately. I could hear papers moving on her end. Then she said, "We're going to look at vendor activity beyond the current year." There was another detail I only learned clearly later, once the forensic work had gone further. Reed's information technology review also found that Chelsea routinely used her Reed-issued laptop to sign into both Reed systems and Hearth and Veil email and cloud services. At that stage, nobody called it evidence of theft. Employees mix personal and business activity on company devices all the time, even when policy says they should not. It was a compliance problem, not a conviction, but it meant one device had touched both worlds, Reed and Hearth and Veil. At the time, I barely understood why that mattered. Melissa did. So did the forensic team. That same week, Dad called me. He sounded different from the man who had stood in my wedding reception, pointing at me. Less angry, more tired. "They're asking for records from last year now," he said. So this is getting ridiculous." I almost said, "You made it ridiculous." I stopped myself. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to tell this woman the companies use some of the same vendors. She knows. You know how accounting works. Tell her mistakes happen." "They do." Dad went quiet. I think he had expected a fight. I continued. "That's why she's checking. You're enjoying this." There it was. The accusation beneath the accusation. "No. You always wanted Chelsea's business to fail. I wanted her to understand the numbers. You wanted to be right." Ethan's words came back to me. That was the problem with painful truths. Once one person said them honestly, they became harder to dismiss when someone else used them unfairly. "I did want to be right," I said. Dad seemed surprised. I went on. "For years, I wanted you to admit I was right about controls. I wanted you to admit you trusted people instead of systems and made me look paranoid for trying to protect the company." He said nothing. "But that does not change where the money went." "You don't know where all the money went." "No, I don't." I could almost feel him waiting for the argument. I did not give him one. "I'm letting the people with the records answer that," Dad exhaled. "Chelsea says this is destroying her business. If her business did nothing wrong, the records will matter more than what I think." For once, there was nothing he could say to that. After we hung up, I sat beside Ethan on the couch and told him about the call. I admitted that I had told Dad I wanted to be right. Ethan asked how that felt, and I told him it felt disgusting. He smiled until I reminded him I was serious. Then I admitted I still thought I was right. He said he knew that too. I leaned against him. The annoying part is that apparently I can be right and still behave badly. I've been trying to find a gentle way to tell you that since we met. I elbowed him. He laughed and kissed the top of my head. For the first time since our wedding, I spent an entire evening without opening my laptop. It did not solve anything. It did remind me there was a life outside Reed. The next morning, Melissa called before 9. Her voice was more formal than usual. We found additional transactions. I stood beside the kitchen counter. "How many?" "I'm not ready to give you a number." "Same supplier?" "Some overlap, some different vendors." "Hearth and Veil?" "We are checking destination, supporting documentation, and authorization on each item." My hand tightened around the edge of the counter. "What do you need from me?" "Nothing right now." That answer would once have made me angry. This time, I accepted it. Then Melissa paused and said there was one other thing. The lender wanted the review widened. Reed's revolving line depended on the company being able to demonstrate reliable financial controls, and given what had already surfaced, counsel had agreed. I asked how far they were going. Melissa did not tell me how much they had found. She did not accuse Chelsea. She did not call what we were seeing fraud. She gave me the one answer that frightened my father far more than any accusation I could have made. We're going back 2 years. By the first week of December, the review had become too large for anyone in my family to keep calling it a mistake. Melissa did not give me unrestricted access to Reed's books, and by then I had stopped asking for information I was not entitled to see. What she did give me was enough to understand the categories her team was testing. Some Reed payments had gone to suppliers for goods or services that appeared to benefit Hearth and Vale. Other charges had been coded as normal Reed freight or warehouse costs, even though shipping records pointed toward Chelsea's operation. There were also company card expenses for packaging and warehouse processing that made sense for Reed at first glance, but were connected to Hearth and Vale orders when the supporting documents were examined. The individual transactions varied in size, and Melissa warned me that some could still be explained or offset by money already repaid. Even with those cautions, the number her team was working with had reached approximately $287,000. I remember repeating it because my mind resisted the scale. 287,000? Melissa told me that was the current suspicious exposure, not a final loss figure. Some transactions were still being verified. Some might have legitimate explanations, and any money already reimbursed would have to be credited before anyone calculated the actual loss. I understood every qualification she gave me, but the number still sat heavily in my chest. $50,000 had been large enough for my father to bring police officers to my wedding. Nearly 6 times that amount was large enough to threaten more than Chelsea's side business. Reed was not some billionaire corporation that could lose money without noticing. It employed around 50 people, relied on a revolving line of credit to manage working capital, and paid suppliers and employees from cash that had to keep moving. $287,000 was not an accounting inconvenience. My first thought was not victory. It was payroll. That surprised me, because only weeks earlier, I had been angry enough to want Dad to feel every consequence of ignoring me. Now, I imagined employees I had known for years opening their banking apps on a Friday and finding nothing there because my family had turned company money into a private safety net. Some of those employees had attended my wedding. Some had watched Dad accuse me. None of them deserved to lose a paycheck because Robert could not distinguish trust from control, or because Chelsea could not admit that Hearth and Vale was failing. That was the first time the size of the problem forced my anger into something more complicated. Melissa told me the widening review had also located something I had mentioned during our first interviews. The old Treasury Key serial log still existed in Reed's archived records. When she said that, I immediately thought of the conference table 3 years earlier, the row of small devices in front of me, and Chelsea laughing because I had assigned each one a number. Back then, the log had felt like one more battle I had lost with Dad. Now it was one of the few clean records left from the system I had tried to build. Melissa did not send me the entire archive. She told me only the part relevant to the transaction that had started everything. The bank's authentication records showed that the $50,000 payment had been approved using Robert's Treasury credential and hardware key number 14. The archived serial log showed that key 14 had been assigned to my father. My own key had been a different device, and the records confirmed it had been returned when I left Reed. Between my off-boarding documentation, the bank's authentication data, and the key log, there was no longer a serious basis for saying I had used my old access to authorize that transfer. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt tired. There was something almost pathetic about needing a 3-year-old serial number log to establish what my father could have learned by asking questions before walking into my reception. I asked Melissa whether Key 14 proved Robert had sent the money himself. She said no. Robert had already admitted that he regularly handed Chelsea the device when she performed legitimate treasury work for him. That was terrible control, but it was not secret. Possession of the key did not tell them who had pressed approve on one particular morning. That distinction mattered because Dad immediately tried to use it both ways. When he called me after learning about the keylog, he sounded relieved that the device was his rather than mine, then irritated when he realized that did not solve his problem. Chelsea used that key all the time, he said, for real company work. I told him I knew. He said that meant the key proved nothing against her. I agreed again, which seemed to frustrate him because he was prepared for an argument. Then he asked, "So why are they still digging?" I told him because a key assigned to him had authorized a payment to a supplier Chelsea owed money, while the document he carried to my wedding falsely named me. The key alone did not prove Chelsea made the transfer, but it made his original accusation look even worse. He went quiet before saying, "I acted on what I had." That sentence nearly pulled me into another fight. I wanted to tell him he had acted on what he wanted to believe. Instead, I said, "Then maybe next time make sure what you have is real." He hung up shortly afterward, and I was left staring at the phone with that familiar mixture of satisfaction and regret. I was getting better at not cutting people with the truth, but better did not mean good. A few days later, Melissa called about Chelsea's Reed laptop. The Information Technology Review had already established that Chelsea used the company-issued device for more than company business. She had regularly opened Hearth and Veil email and cloud storage accounts from it. At first, that had been treated as a policy problem, not evidence of theft. Plenty of employees blurred work and personal use. But when the device was preserved and examined, locally synced files and cached data from Chelsea's Hearth and Veil accounts became relevant. Melissa described one spreadsheet carefully. The file itself had been stored in a Hearth and Veil cloud location, but fragments and a synchronized copy had remained on the Reed laptop because Chelsea had accessed that account from the machine. The title was ordinary enough that I almost missed the significance when Melissa first said it. Bridge repayment. The columns were even more revealing. Reed paid. H and V. O's. Replace by. I sat down at my desk and stared at the wall while she explained what was inside. Several amounts on the spreadsheet corresponded to transactions the forensic team had already identified in Reed's books. Beside them were dates in the future, apparently marking when money was expected to be replaced. Some lines had short notes tied to sales periods or anticipated cash coming into Hearth and Veil. The spreadsheet did not say, "I stole from my father." It did not say, "I am committing fraud." It did not even use the word loan. It looked like something a person might create when trying to keep track of money temporarily moved from one place to another. That made it more disturbing, not less. Chelsea had apparently been keeping her own private accounting of what Reed paid and what Hearth and Veil owed back. She knew the businesses were separate enough that balances had to be tracked. She knew money going out of Reed created an obligation on the other side. She knew replacement dates mattered. Whether she had convinced herself she was borrowing rather than stealing was not something I could know from a spreadsheet, and Melissa warned me not to make psychological claims the document could not prove. What it did show was knowledge. The transactions were not merely random expenses that no one had noticed. I asked if that was enough to prove everything. No, I laughed despite myself. I knew you were going to say that. It is evidence, strong evidence. But it still has to be authenticated, matched to transactions, and considered with the rest of the records. You really know how to ruin a dramatic moment. That's why people hire me. The spreadsheet bothered me for a reason. I could not immediately explain. Then I realized it reminded me of how Chelsea had always handled mistakes. She did not think consequences disappeared. She thought they could be postponed until a better version of the future arrived. When she overdrew an account in college, Mom covered it and Chelsea promised to pay her back after summer. When she forgot a family obligation, she sent flowers later and acted as if the original hurt had been erased. Hearth and Veil seemed to have become the largest version of the same habit. Pay this now, replace it later, get through this week, fix it next month. Keep moving until the consequences stop chasing you. The review also produced something that seemed to point away from Chelsea. Several suspicious vendor and invoice entries had been made under Martin Keller's accounting username. Martin had been Reed's senior bookkeeper for years. He was nearing retirement, knew the company's routines better than almost anyone, and had never hidden how much he disliked the controls I tried to introduce. Whenever I demanded a second approval or forced a password change, Martin treated it as evidence that young people enjoyed creating work for older employees. I had never liked him. That fact should have made me more cautious. Instead, it made me stupid for about 48 hours. When Melissa first told me that Martin's user appeared on several questionable entries, my mind built a theory almost immediately. Chelsea knew vendors and had access to Dad's treasury key. Martin knew accounting and hated my control procedures. Maybe Chelsea had needed someone inside the books. Maybe Martin had helped disguise the entries. Maybe that explained why transactions could be coded under normal read categories without attracting attention. I did not say any of that publicly. I did not call Martin. But I said enough to Melissa for her to hear where my mind was going. He always fought me on passwords, I told her. And vendor controls. So now his username is on the entries. Yes. And Chelsea could not necessarily do all of this alone. Melissa looked at me through the video call. Why not? I stopped. She continued. You're doing it again. Doing what? Building people around the evidence instead of building the timeline. I felt my face heat. That is not what I'm doing. You disliked Martin before this investigation began. For good reasons. So did your father dislike you. That shut me up. Melissa let the silence sit for a moment before she said, At your wedding, your father saw your name on a document and attached everything he already believed about you. Angry former employee, financial expertise, old resentment. It made the accusation feel complete before he tested it. Right now, you see Martin's username and you are attaching everything you already believe about him. Sloppy, resistant to controls, nearing retirement. I leaned back in my chair. He lied about things before. So have you. I looked at her sharply. She smiled faintly. Not about theft, but everyone lies, minimizes, forgets, or protects themselves. We test the timeline. I hated that she was right. More than that, I hated that the mistake looked so much like Dad's. I had spent weeks telling myself the difference between us was that I followed evidence. The first time the evidence brushed against someone I already disliked, I started sprinting ahead of it. What does the timeline say? I asked. Not enough yet. That became my answer too. Martin had been interviewed. According to Melissa, he insisted he had never shared his accounting password with Chelsea. He admitted Robert sometimes pressured people to cover each other's work, but he maintained that Chelsea did not know his credentials. On the surface, that should have slowed suspicion around him. Then, the device logs came back. Martin's accounting username had been used from Chelsea's assigned Reed laptop. Not once, several times. More important, at least some of those sessions occurred when Martin was not physically in the office. That was the point where even Melissa stopped calling it an ordinary inconsistency. I asked whether Martin could have logged in remotely. Possible in theory, she said, but the activity being reviewed had originated from Chelsea's company device during periods Martin's schedule and other records placed him elsewhere. They still needed to determine how his credentials had been obtained and whether he had lied about sharing them. Dad clung to Martin immediately. Maybe he did it, he told me on the phone. Did what? All of it. I closed my eyes. The speed of his relief was almost embarrassing. Dad, his username being on entries does not explain the $50,000 payment to Chelsea's supplier. He had access. So did half the people you trusted. He could have manipulated the invoices. Why? How should I know? Maybe he was stealing. Where did the money go to Martin? Dad had no answer. I continued. Did Martin owe Hearth and Vale suppliers money? Maybe Chelsea was being used. That was the moment I realized how desperately Dad wanted an outsider. If Martin had done it, Dad could fire him, condemn him, repair the system, and return to believing his family was basically intact. An employee stealing from Reed was a business problem. Chelsea stealing from Reed was a verdict on years of decisions Dad had made as a father and owner. I almost told him he sounded desperate. Instead, I remembered Melissa's warning. We don't know yet, I said. Dad actually laughed. Now, you want to be careful? He had earned that one. Yes, I said. Now I want to be careful. That week, I went back through my own notes and crossed out every sentence that depended on what I thought someone was capable of. I replaced them with dates, records, sources, and questions. It was almost embarrassingly therapeutic. Martin disliked controls. That was personality. Martin's username appeared on certain entries. That was evidence. Sessions under his username came from Chelsea's laptop while Martin was elsewhere. That was stronger evidence, but it still did not tell us whether Chelsea stole his password, whether he gave it to her, or whether someone else had access. Separating those things calmed me. It also prepared me for what came next. Mid-December, Melissa asked me to join a call with company counsel. Her tone was different enough that I knew before she spoke that they had found something substantial. The attorney began by reminding me that the investigation was still active and that I should not circulate what I was about to hear to relatives or former co-workers. I agreed. Melissa shared her screen. I was not looking at Reed's bank portal. I was looking at a document history produced from the forensic image of Chelsea's work environment. The transaction summary from my wedding. The page Dad had carried into the ballroom. For weeks, everyone had focused on the printed copy. Now Melissa's team had located the native editable file associated with it. She showed me the version sequence. An earlier saved version contained the transaction date, amount, account reference, and other ordinary fields. The field beside initiated by did not contain my name. I leaned closer to the screen. Go to the next one. Melissa did. A later version appeared. Samantha. Reed. My throat tightened. When was that edit made? After the transaction had already occurred. From whose account? Melissa was careful. The file profile and device artifacts tied the revision to Chelsea's work environment. That did not mean a single metadata field magically proved who physically touched every key, but the edit had been made within the digital environment associated with her assigned company device and user activity. I stared at my own name. Until that moment, there had still been ways for Chelsea to describe the $50,000 payment as a mistake, a vendor allocation problem, a temporary advance, bad documentation. Even the bridge repayment sheet could be framed as evidence that she intended to replace money rather than permanently take it. My name changed the meaning. No accounting mistake required Samantha Reed to appear on that page. No temporary transfer required anyone to manufacture a former employee's identity inside an internal report. Someone had not simply moved money. Someone had created a story about who moved it. The company attorney explained that they were preparing a supplemental package for the detective who had received Dad's original complaint on the wedding night. It would include the bank authentication information, the archived key record, the preliminary loss map, and the native report findings, because the suspected loss now extended well beyond the original $50,000, and the records indicated deliberate alteration. The matter would continue through financial crimes review while Melissa's forensic work proceeded. I asked the question I had been avoiding. Does this mean Chelsea is going to be arrested? The attorney said no immediate conclusion should be assumed. Evidence still had to be reviewed. Additional records authenticated, witnesses interviewed, and the scope of the loss established. Law enforcement would decide its own next steps. Months earlier, that answer would have infuriated me. Now I nodded. Process. This time, process was my friend. After the call ended, I sat alone in my office for almost an hour. Ethan was at work. The house was quiet. I could have called Dad. I could have called Mom. I could have called every person who had watched me stand in my wedding dress while my father accused me of stealing from him. I did none of those things. I thought about Chelsea instead. Not about what she had been thinking. I still did not know that. I did not know whether she had planned for Dad to confront me privately, whether she thought the report would buy her a week, or whether she had expected me to disappear from the family the way I had disappeared from Reed. Those answers would come, if they came at all, from evidence or admissions later. What I knew was simpler. The $50,000 payment had been authenticated with a key that belonged to Dad, not me. The money had gone to a creditor tied to Hearth and Vale. A spreadsheet from Chelsea's business tracked Reed payments as amounts Hearth and Vale owed back. Suspicious exposure had climbed toward $287,000. Martin's username appeared on some entries. but his activity was showing up from Chelsea's device. And the document that had turned my wedding into a public accusation had existed before my name was added to it. That last fact changed everything. For the first time, this was no longer only a story about money that might have been moved improperly. It was a story about evidence being manufactured against me. A few minutes before 5 that afternoon, Melissa sent me a short follow-up confirming that the supplemental findings had been preserved and provided through counsel to the detective. I read the message twice, then closed my laptop. I did not call my father. I did not call Chelsea. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and waited for Ethan to come home. I had spent most of my life believing the smartest person in the room was the one who found the answer first. That winter taught me something harder. Sometimes intelligence meant knowing when an answer had finally earned the right to be believed. The first version of the report did not have my name on it. The second one did. And by then, the forensic trail had connected that edit to Chelsea's work environment. Martin Keller confessed 3 days before Christmas, although not to stealing money. Melissa called me afterward because his admission helped explain several of the accounting entries that had been bothering her team, and because I had worked with him long enough to clarify how the old system had been used. Martin admitted that, during a particularly busy stretch the previous year, he had given Chelsea his accounting application password after Dad told everyone in finance to cover for each other while Martin was away from the office. He had meant it to be temporary. He never changed the password afterward. When Melissa first interviewed him, he denied ever sharing credentials because he knew doing so violated the procedures that were already weak enough without people passing passwords around. At 58, with retirement finally close enough for him to imagine it, Martin had been terrified that admitting the violation would cost him his job, his reputation, or both. The forensic logs did not make him look good, but they also did not make him Chelsea's secret partner. Several questionable vendor and invoice entries had been made under Martin's accounting username, exactly as Melissa had told me earlier. The important difference was where those sessions came from. The activity originated from Chelsea's assigned read laptop at times when scheduling records and other company information placed Martin away from the office. No suspicious payment flowed to Martin. No Hearth and Veil supplier benefited him. No message tied him to Chelsea's business. His wrongdoing was smaller and much more ordinary. He had given away a password he should never have shared, reused it for far too long, then lied about it when investigators asked, because he wanted to protect himself. When Melissa explained that, I felt embarrassed by how quickly I had wanted Martin to be guilty. He had irritated me for years. He complained whenever I forced password changes. He thought dual approval was unnecessary bureaucracy. He once told me that if people spent half as much time working as they did documenting their work, Reed would double its profits. When his username appeared in the suspicious records, I had almost been relieved. A conspiracy between Chelsea and Martin would have been easy to understand. She needed someone inside accounting. He hated controls. They worked together. Clean motive, clean villain, clean answer. Instead, the answer was that nobody needed a sophisticated conspiracy because Reed had spent years treating credentials like office supplies. Melissa put it more neatly. A control is not there because you believe everyone is dishonest, she said. It's there because eventually one trusted person may do something they shouldn't, and when that day comes, you need to know who did what. I looked at the note taped beside my monitor, the one that said not to confuse a compelling theory with a completed test. You enjoy repeating lessons until they hurt, don't you? I bill by the hour. I laughed, but the lesson stayed with me. Martin's lie had delayed part of the review and would have workplace consequences. It deserved consequences. What it did not deserve was for me to inflate his carelessness into a crime because that version satisfied me emotionally. The same culture Dad had defended as trust had created the opening Chelsea appeared to have used. Shared passwords, loose vendor procedures. Hardware keys passed from hand to hand, people covering for each other because Dad valued speed over documentation. If Melissa's team was right, Chelsea had not needed to build an elaborate secret system. She had simply used the one already there. I thought Martin's confession would be the most uncomfortable thing I learned that week. Then my mother asked to meet me alone. She texted on a Thursday morning and asked whether I could see her somewhere away from Reed and away from Dad. That alone made me suspicious. Mom had spent most of the week since the wedding, acting as if every conversation should include the entire family because privacy, in her mind, usually meant someone was refusing reconciliation. When I asked what she wanted to discuss, she wrote, "Chelsea." I almost declined. Then I remembered Melissa's rule. Facts first. I agreed to meet Mom at a small coffee shop across town where we were unlikely to run into anyone who knew us. I arrived early and chose a table near the back. When Mom walked in, she looked older than she had at my wedding. That thought made me angry with myself because I immediately felt guilty for noticing. Diane Reed had always known how to look fragile without trying. It was one of the reasons people rushed to comfort her. Samantha was strong. Diane was overwhelmed. Chelsea was sensitive. Robert was stubborn. Everyone in my family had a reason they needed accommodation except me. Mom took off her coat and sat across from me. She ordered tea but barely touched it. For several minutes, she talked about Chelsea's stress. Hearth and Vale was losing suppliers. Employees there were worried. Chelsea was hardly sleeping. She had lost weight. Lawyers were expensive. People were saying awful things. I let her continue until I realized she had not mentioned my wedding once. "Why am I here?" I asked. Mom looked wounded. "I'm trying to explain what your sister is going through. I know what she's going through." "No, you know what investigators are saying." "I know what happened to me too, Samantha." "Mom, I'm not sitting here for an hour while you explain how hard this is for Chelsea." Her fingers tightened around the paper sleeve on her cup. "Why do you always make everything so harsh?" I almost answered the way I would have a month earlier. Instead, I took a breath. "If you have a fact I need to know, tell me. If you brought me here to ask me to drop this, soften my statement, or protect Chelsea from consequences, I'm leaving. I'm not asking you to lie." That is a very specific sentence. Mom looked down at the table. My stomach tightened. "What happened?" She did not answer immediately. When she finally looked at me again, the softness in her face had changed into something closer to shame. "There was a charge in March." I waited. "A Reed card," she said. "A company card." "What kind of charge?" "Something for Hearth and Vale. Packaging, I think. Or warehouse processing. I don't remember exactly." My pulse quickened. "How did you see it?" "Chelsea was at the house. She had papers out. Your father had asked me to help sort some receipts because he was behind on expenses. I saw the company card statement and recognized the vendor name from Chelsea's business." "What did you do?" I asked her. "And?" She said she had used the wrong card. I stared at my mother. Mom rushed on. "She said it was an accident. She had both cards in her wallet. She had been dealing with a supplier problem and grabbed the wrong one." "How much?" "It wasn't like the 50,000. "How much?" She gave me the amount. It was not huge compared with what Melissa's team was now reviewing, but it was not the kind of charge someone would casually overlook either. "What happened next?" Mom folded and unfolded the edge of a napkin. I gave her the money to put it back. I felt something inside me go very still. "You gave Chelsea money. She was short that month." "To repay Reed." "Yes." "And she repaid it?" "She said she did." "Did you see that?" Mom hesitated. "She showed me the payment afterward." I leaned back. Later, Melissa and company counsel verified the basic money trail. Mom had transferred personal funds to Chelsea. Shortly afterward, Chelsea reimbursed the company account. That part of my mother's story was true. She had not entered anything into Reed's accounting system herself. She had not stolen money. What she had done was see a company expense tied to Chelsea's private business, fund the repayment, and keep the entire incident from Dad and accounting. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" I asked. Mom looked at me as though the answer should have been obvious. "Because she fixed it." "No, you fixed it. She paid the company back. With your money. She paid me back later. That isn't the point. What did you want me to do? March into your father's office and tell him Chelsea used the wrong card once?" "Yes." Mom's eyes widened. "At minimum, accounting should have known why the reimbursement happened. You know what your father would have done. He would have asked questions. He would have humiliated her. The word hit me. Humiliated. I thought about my father pointing at me in my wedding dress, while Mom demanded that police arrest me. You were worried Dad might humiliate Chelsea? Mom looked away. I felt heat climb into my face. Did you worry about that when you came to my wedding with police? That was different. How? We thought you had taken $50,000. Based on a report you never verified. Your father believed it. And you? She did not answer. I leaned forward. Did you believe I stole from the company? I didn't know what to believe. But you were certain enough to tell police to arrest me. Her eyes filled with tears. A month earlier, that would have ended the conversation. Mom cried. I softened. Mom looked overwhelmed. I became practical. It had happened so many times that neither of us even noticed the transition anymore. This time, I stayed where I was. You knew Chelsea had already mixed her business with Reed money once. She repaid it. You knew enough to hide it. I was trying to protect her. From what? From your father. From losing her business. From another fight. She was already under so much pressure. I could hear Melissa in my head telling me not to turn emotion into evidence. Mom's confession did not prove the March charge was part of the larger scheme. It did not prove Chelsea had been stealing at that point. It proved something different, and in some ways more painful. Mom had seen smoke. She had chosen to cover the alarm. Did Chelsea tell you not to tell Dad? Mom hesitated. She begged me not to. Why? She said it was an embarrassing mistake. She said if Dad found out, he would treat her like a child and maybe stop supporting Hearth and Vale. Supporting it how? Advice, contacts, sometimes helping with vendors, money? Not that I knew. I believed that part, or at least I had no evidence to disbelieve it. Mom reached across the table, but I moved my hands into my lap. Samantha, she isn't like you. I almost smiled because I knew what was coming. You're stronger. There it was. Mom continued. You've always been able to handle things. Chelsea gets overwhelmed. She panics. She makes bad decisions when she feels trapped. I stared at her. What? You keep saying that like it is a compliment. It is. No, it isn't. Mom looked genuinely confused. You call me strong when what you mean is that hurting me is cheaper. Her face changed. That is not fair. It is exactly what happens. Chelsea falls apart, so everyone protects her. Dad gets angry, so everyone avoids confronting him. You get overwhelmed, so everyone has to calm you down. And me? I'm strong. So apparently I can absorb whatever is left. I never asked you to absorb anything. You asked me to be the older one my entire life. That is what families do. No. Families do not decide one child can survive being hurt better than the other, and then call that fairness. Mom's tears spilled over. I did not enjoy it. That mattered to me. A part of me wanted satisfaction. I wanted the reversal. I wanted her to feel, even briefly, what I had felt standing at my own wedding while she chose Chelsea's version of events over me. Instead, I mostly felt tired. Mom wiped her cheek. What are you going to do with what I told you? The question was revealing. Not, does this help? Not, was I wrong? What are you going to do? She was afraid I would expose her. I considered it. I am not proud of how tempting that was. I imagined calling the relatives who had accused me of trying to bury Chelsea. I imagined telling them our mother had quietly paid off an earlier company card irregularity months before the wedding. I imagined the family group chat exploding, while Mom tried to explain why protecting Chelsea was different from protecting me. The image felt good. That was exactly why I did not do it. I'm going to tell Melissa. Mom's eyes widened. Samantha, you said you weren't asking me to lie. I'm not. Then this is relevant. It was months ago. That makes it more relevant, not less. Do you have to tell investigators everything? If they ask, yes. She paid it back. That does not erase why it happened. Mom lowered her voice. You don't understand what this could do to her. I looked at her for a long time. That sentence is the whole problem. Mom flinched. I continued more quietly. You keep asking what truth will do to Chelsea. You never ask what Chelsea did that made the truth dangerous. She stared at her tea. I did not post anything. I did not call family. I did not send screenshots around. I left the coffee shop, sat in my car for several minutes, and called Ethan before anyone else. I found out Mom knew about something before the wedding. He was quiet while I explained. When I finished, he asked, "What are you going to do?" I already told her I'm giving it to Melissa. Good. That's all you have? What do you want me to say? I don't know. Maybe that my family is insane. I think we established that at the reception. Despite myself, I laughed. Then I admitted the part I was less proud of. I want to tell everyone. I know. I want every person who sent me one of those messages about being vindictive to know Mom had already covered something. Would that help the investigation? No. Would it help you? For about 10 minutes. And after that, I looked through the windshield at the gray parking lot. I'd have created another public spectacle. Probably. I sighed. You're very annoying. You married me anyway. I forwarded the relevant information through the proper channel. Melissa later verified the transfer from Mom to Chelsea and the reimbursement that followed. The evidence did not turn Diane into a thief. It turned her into something less dramatic and more familiar. Honorably, she had seen a smaller warning months earlier and chosen family peace over accountability. That discovery changed how I understood the wedding. Until then, the deepest betrayal had been that Mom believed Chelsea instead of me. After our coffee shop conversation, I realized the pattern was older. Mom had already learned that when Chelsea created a financial problem, the family could quietly put money around it until the problem disappeared. She had taught my sister that consequences were negotiable if the right person felt sorry for her. Melissa also finished sorting out the Martin problem that week. His password admission matched the device evidence. His accounting account had been used from Chelsea's laptop when he was elsewhere. The entries under his name could no longer be treated as evidence that he had secretly participated in the scheme. He still faced disciplinary consequences for credential sharing and lying during the review, but no evidence tied him to Hearth and Vale's benefit or to the money itself. The red herring disappeared. The trail became cleaner, and then Mom gave me something else before we left the coffee shop. Something I had not understood the significance of until later. She told me Dad had signed paperwork Chelsea brought him related to Treasury access and operational authority. Mom did not know the exact documents. She only remembered complaining that Robert signed business papers without reading them closely, and Chelsea had laughed that Dad trusted her to handle the details. That sounds like Dad, I said. He always told her she could do whatever she needed for the business. I looked at Mom. What exactly does that mean? You know your father. If Chelsea called and said a vendor needed something, he told her to handle it. If she needed access, he signed what they put in front of him. That does not mean he authorized her to use Reed money for Hearth and Vale. I know. Does he? Mom looked uncomfortable. What are you asking? I'm asking whether Dad remembers what he actually signed. I don't know. That answer worried me more than if she had said yes. I did not jump to the conclusion that Robert had known about the transfers. Nothing I had seen supported that. He had been careless, stubborn, and reckless with access, but those were not the same thing as knowingly authorizing Chelsea to move company money into her private business. Still, I could suddenly see the defense forming before anyone had formally made it. Dad had signed access delegations. Dad had handed Chelsea his treasury key. Dad had told her, "Whatever you need for the business." If Chelsea eventually admitted that Reed money had gone to Hearth and Vale, she might not have to deny touching it at all. She could argue that Dad knew, that he approved, that the transfers were temporary advances inside a family business where nobody bothered with formal documents. The facts would have to establish the difference between broad trust and specific authorization. Family memory would not be enough. On the drive home, I kept thinking about the irony. My father had spent years refusing to document authority because he believed family trust made documentation unnecessary. Now the absence of clear documentation might become the thing Chelsea used to pull him into the same hole with her. By Christmas, I no longer wanted a simple villain because the truth had become too complicated for one. Chelsea appeared to be at the center of the money trail, but she had operated inside a system built by dozens of smaller choices. Martin shared a password because Dad wanted speed. Mom hid a company card problem because she wanted peace. Dad signed access paperwork without reading closely because he trusted Chelsea. And I had spent years believing that if I warned everyone clearly enough, their refusal to listen became entirely their problem. Chelsea was responsible for what she did, but she had not created the conditions alone. The most uncomfortable part was recognizing that responsibility could be individual, even when failure was collective. That afternoon, Melissa called to confirm that counsel was retrieving Robert's delegation and Treasury access documents so they could establish exactly what authority Chelsea had been given. I told her what Mom remembered, but I was careful to frame it as memory, not proof. Melissa said, "Good, we'll use the records." I almost laughed. Of course she would. Records and timelines. After we hung up, I stood beside our Christmas tree and watched Ethan untangle a string of lights he had been trying to hang for 10 minutes. Months earlier, I would have taken the entire knot out of his hands because I knew I could fix it faster. Instead, I watched him work until he finally glanced over. "You're really going to stand there and not help?" "I'm practicing boundaries. With Christmas lights, you have to start somewhere." He smiled and went back to the knot. My phone buzzed on the table. It was another message from Mom. She had remembered one more detail about the paperwork Chelsea used to bring Dad. Robert rarely read every page. Sometimes he signed where Chelsea placed a tab and told her to handle whatever needed handling. I looked at the message and felt none of the vindication I might have expected. My mother had spent weeks insisting Chelsea had acted alone. Now she had handed me the first fact that could allow Chelsea to claim the opposite. Dad had signed away more access than he even remembered. By January, Reed Industrial Packaging was still operating. But Dad could no longer pretend the investigation was something happening only to Chelsea. The bank had replaced the compromised Treasury credentials and tightened the way users were added and authenticated. Payments still went out. Employees still came to work. Customers still placed orders. Nobody had frozen every dollar in the company's accounts. The problem was that everything involving cash had become slower, more documented, and more visible. Reed's revolving line lender wanted to know what had happened, how much money was actually missing, and what Dad intended to change so it could not happen again. For years, Reed had used that line of credit the way many growing businesses did. Inventory arrived before every customer paid. Payroll did not wait because a large invoice was 30 days outstanding. The line smoothed the gaps. Losing access to it would not make the company disappear overnight, but it would make every ordinary cash problem harder. Suppliers who heard that Reed was undergoing a fraud review began asking for shorter payment terms. Some wanted deposits. The bank wanted additional approval controls. The lender wanted Melissa's independent findings and a remediation plan before continuing the flexibility Dad had taken for granted. Dad hated every minute of it. He called me one Monday morning and spent nearly 10 minutes explaining that Reed had never missed payroll in its history. I listened while he described the company as though someone had accused it of being insolvent rather than poorly controlled. "I built this place from nothing," he said. "We've survived recessions, supply shortages, customers going bankrupt. Now some lender who's been with us for 12 years is acting like I need permission to pay my own people. You borrowed their money. That's how credit lines work, Samantha. Then you understand why they care how your financial controls work." He went quiet. I could almost see his expression. "What do you want me to say?" he asked. "Nothing. You always have something to say." "Not anymore." That was harder for him to hear than an argument. Dad was used to our fights because fights allowed him to believe we were two equally stubborn people with different management philosophies. My refusal to keep fighting forced him to deal with other people whose opinions could not be dismissed as daughterly criticism. The bank did not care that he had built Reed. The lender did not care that Chelsea was family. Melissa did not care that Dad thought dual approvals were insulting. They cared about records. The most important ones surfaced in the second week of January. Melissa called me late in the afternoon and asked if I remembered the controls memo I had described during our earlier interviews. I told her I did. We found the original email thread in the company archive. For a moment, I said nothing. I had remembered writing that memo so clearly that I sometimes wondered whether memory had sharpened it over the years. I remembered the subjects. I I remembered the argument. I remembered Dad's reply. But memory was not evidence. The archive was. Melissa confirmed that the original message had been preserved in Reed's email system along with Dad's response. The date matched what I had told her. So did the recommendations. No shared accounting credentials. Secondary approval for new vendors. Prompt removal of access when employees left or roles changed. Formal custody records for Treasury authentication devices. Two-person approval for higher-risk payments. Melissa did not need me to explain the irony. Those were the exact weaknesses her review had spent weeks untangling. Then she read Dad's old response. Too much red tape. Use judgment. I closed my eyes. For about 5 seconds, I felt something wonderful and ugly. I had been right. Not vaguely right. Not emotionally right. Not right because I remembered the past more favorably than Dad did. I had identified the risks in writing 3 years before one of those risks became a nearly $300,000 disaster. There were no sweeter words in the English language than I told you so. There were also very few more dangerous ones. Melissa must have heard something in my silence because she said, "This establishes notice. It doesn't establish that Robert knew Chelsea would misuse access." I understand. It also doesn't transfer responsibility for her conduct to him. I understand that too. But it matters for remediation. Yes. I looked at the framed wedding photograph Ethan had placed on the shelf across from my desk. It was taken before the police arrived. We were both laughing at something I no longer remembered. 3 months earlier, I would have forwarded Dad's old reply back to him with the date circled. Instead, I asked Melissa, "Does counsel have the full thread?" "Yes." "Then you don't need anything from me." "No?" I thanked her and ended the call. Then I sat there and hated how much I wanted to call my father anyway. Ethan came home about half an hour later. He found me in the kitchen chopping vegetables far more aggressively than necessary. What did the carrots do? They ignored internal controls. That'll teach them. I put the knife down and told him about the memo. He leaned against the counter. "You were right." "I know. You don't look happy." "I am. That explains the carrots." I laughed despite myself, then admitted what bothered me. "I want him to read it. He probably will." "No, I want to be there when he reads it." Ethan understood immediately. "You want to watch him realize it?" "Yes." "And then?" "I don't know." He waited. I sighed. "I want him to admit that none of this was unpredictable." He kept saying nobody could have imagined Chelsea doing something like this. "Could you?" "No." "Then what did you predict?" I knew where he was going. That weak controls would eventually make it possible for someone to misuse access and make it difficult to trace. That's different from predicting Chelsea. "Yes." He nodded. "So be right about what you were actually right about." It irritated me when he made things that simple. Company counsel sent Dad the memo as part of the remediation materials 2 days later. He called me that evening. "I suppose you're happy." I nearly asked whether he had called to apologize, but I knew the answer. "About what?" "You know exactly what." "The memo?" "You gave it to them." "No." He paused. "I told Melissa it existed. Your company archive gave it to them." "That's the same thing." "No, Dad, it really isn't." "You knew they'd use it against me." I walked into my office and closed the door so Ethan would not have to listen. "How are they using it against you?" "To make it sound like I knowingly ignored a crime." "That isn't what the memo says." "It makes me look negligent." I let the silence sit. Dad finally said, "Say it." "Say what?" "That you told me so." I almost did. Every part of me that had spent years being called difficult, suspicious, rigid, and controlling wanted those 4 words. Instead, I asked him, "Were you warned?" His breathing changed. "That isn't fair. It's the only question that matters. I knew you wanted tighter procedures." "Did I specifically warn you about shared passwords?" "Yes." "Vendor approval?" "Yes." "Hardware keys?" "Yes." "Access removal?" "Yes, Samantha." "Then you were warned." I did not know my own daughter would steal from me. I sat back in my chair. "Controls are not designed because you know exactly who will betray you." He said nothing. "They're designed because eventually someone might make a mistake, lie, steal, panic, or do something you didn't expect. A lock isn't an accusation against every person who walks past the door. You always thought everyone needed a lock. I thought millions of dollars needed one. Dad gave a bitter laugh. You enjoying this? There had been a time when I would have lied. No, I said. But part of me enjoys being proven right. I'm trying not to confuse that with justice. That answer seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. He asked, "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I don't want Reed to fail just so you finally admit I was right." His voice changed. "Who said Reed is going to fail?" "Nobody." "Then don't talk like that." "Dad, the lender is tightening your line. Vendors are changing terms. Melissa is still calculating losses. You called because you're scared." "I'm not scared." "Fine." I did not argue. That ended the conversation faster than anything else could have. Within 2 weeks, the remediation plan stopped being theoretical. Company counsel and Melissa documented the control failures, and the lender made it clear that Reed would have a much easier time maintaining its working capital flexibility if Dad accepted independent financial oversight. The bank wanted stronger Treasury administration as well. No court removed my father. No government official marched into Reed and took his office. Dad remained the majority owner. He simply reached the point where refusing stronger controls would make his own company harder to finance. So he chose. Reed hired an outside controller. Treasury payments above defined thresholds required 2 authorized people. Vendor setup had to be documented and separately approved. Accounting passwords could not be shared. Hardware authentication devices were assigned and tracked. User access had to be reviewed when roles changed. I almost laughed when Melissa described the final package. It looked remarkably familiar. The rules Dad had mocked when I proposed them were now the price of keeping the financial flexibility his company needed. That was his consequence. Not bankruptcy. Not prison. Not losing Reed. Something worse for a man like my father. Every morning, he had to walk into the business he built and operate under the controls he once called unnecessary. I thought that would satisfy me. Then I heard about payroll. It was not a catastrophe. Nobody had missed a paycheck. Melissa was careful about that. But tighter lender conditions, missing cash, shortened vendor terms, and slower Treasury approvals had narrowed Reed's room to maneuver. Management was working through several weeks, where the timing of incoming customer payments mattered much more than Dad was comfortable admitting. A former Reed employee called me after work one afternoon. Then another sent a message. Neither asked me for money. Neither asked me to come back. They were worried about jobs. "Is the company okay?" one of them asked. "I'm not part of management, but you know what's going on. Some of it. People are scared." I knew. That was where my moral victory became inconvenient. It was easy to say Reed's problems belonged to Dad when I imagined Dad alone in his office. It was harder when I pictured warehouse employees, drivers, customer service staff, and accounting clerks who had never ignored my controls because most of them had never had the power to create them. They did not deserve to become casualties of my family's lesson. For one ugly afternoon, I also recognized something else in myself. If Reed collapsed, Dad would finally have to admit I had been right. There would be no debate left, no revision of history. No telling relatives that Samantha was always too cautious. The company would become my proof. I hated that thought the moment I understood it, not because it was impossible, because some part of me wanted it. That evening, I told Ethan, "I had a terrible thought today." "How terrible?" "I wanted Reed to fail." He waited instead of telling me I did not mean it. "I don't want people to lose their jobs," I said. But for maybe 10 seconds, I imagined Dad standing in an empty warehouse and finally understanding. And then, I realized I'd be using 50 employees to win an argument with my father. Ethan nodded. "That sounds like something you wouldn't want to become." It was such a simple sentence that it almost hurt. The next morning, I contacted Melissa and company counsel. I offered limited help. Not employment. Not management. Not money. I would prepare a written historical handoff for the new controller. I would explain the old finance architecture as it existed when I left, identify where certain archived process records had historically been stored, and answer factual questions about procedures I had designed. I put the boundaries in writing. My assistance would be temporary. I would not approve current transactions. I would not sign historical entries. I would not assume responsibility for reconstructing books I had not controlled for 3 years. I would not loan Reed money. I would not become an employee. I would not promise to fix the company. Melissa replied that those terms were reasonable. Dad did not. He called 2 days later. "You're helping the new controller. For a limited handoff. Then come back." I thought I had misheard him. "What?" "Come back to Reed." "No. You haven't even heard what I'm offering." "I don't need to." His irritation rose immediately. "You know this company better than anyone." "No. I knew the finance systems 3 years ago. You built half the controls they're putting in now. That does not make me your controller. We need someone people trust." I almost laughed. "You called police to my wedding because you thought I stole $50,000. That was before we knew what happened. It was before you bothered to find out what happened." I made a mistake. The words caught me off guard. Dad did not apologize easily. He continued before I could answer. "I'm admitting that. I was wrong about you." "Is that what you wanted?" "Once, maybe it had been. Now it sounded painfully small. I wanted you to verify the accusation before you destroyed my wedding. I can't change that." "No, but I can change what happens now." "So can I." There was a long silence. Then Dad said the sentence I had spent my entire adult life being trained to obey. "Come back, fix this." My eyes closed. There it was. "Not Samantha, I want you back." "Not Samantha, I respect what you built." "Not Samantha, I'm sorry I taught everyone that your competence belonged to the family." "Fix this." 3 words that contained my entire role in the Reed family. "I'll complete the historical handoff I agreed to," I said. "That's all. We need more than that." "Then hire more than that. You're my daughter, and I'm not your controller." "Samantha." "No, you need a controller. Those are not the same thing." Dad went silent. For the first time in my life, I heard my own boundary without immediately feeling obligated to soften it. Then my phone signaled another incoming call. Company counsel. I told Dad I had to go and answered. The attorney's voice was controlled, but I could tell something had changed. Chelsea's lawyers had submitted a new position. For weeks, Chelsea had described the suspicious payments as mistakes, temporary movements, or expenses that would eventually have been reimbursed. Now that the records, repayment spreadsheet, access trail, and fake report were closing around her, her defense had shifted. She was no longer saying Dad knew nothing. She was saying he knew everything. According to Chelsea's new account, Robert had authorized the advances to Hearth and Vale. His repeated messages telling her to do whatever you need for the business, his broad operational delegations, the treasury paperwork he signed, and his willingness to let her use his authentication key were being offered as proof that she believed she had permission. I sat completely still. The attorney kept talking, but one thought drowned out the rest. My father had spent months insisting Chelsea betrayed him. Now Chelsea was preparing to defend herself by saying there had been no betrayal at all, because, according to her, Dad had been in on it. Chelsea's new defense reached Dad before it reached me. By the time company counsel called, he had already read the written position her attorney had submitted. And according to the attorney, he had reacted exactly as I would have expected. Outrage first, disbelief second, then a frantic search through old messages for anything that could prove she was lying. The problem was that some of the messages Chelsea cited were real. Dad had written things like, "Whatever you need for the business, handle it," and "I trust you." He had sent those phrases while traveling, during supplier problems, and when Chelsea was covering operational work for Reed. None of them said, "Take Reed's money and use it for Hearth and Vale." None of them mentioned temporary loans, advances, or permission to pay her private company's creditors. But after years of vague instructions and informal delegation, there was enough ambiguity for Chelsea's lawyer to build a story around them. Her position had changed in a way I found almost impressive. For months, she had insisted the questionable expenses were allocation errors, accidental card use, or temporary payments that would have been corrected. Now she acknowledged that some Reed resources had benefited Hearth and Vale. She simply claimed they had done so with Dad's knowledge. The money, according to this version, was not stolen. It was temporary family business support. Dad had always encouraged her to solve problems. He gave her access to his authentication key. He signed broad Treasury delegation documents. He told her to handle things. Therefore, she said, she reasonably believed she had permission to use Reed resources when Hearth and Vale needed short-term help. It was the kind of defense that worked best if nobody asked what Dad had actually known about any specific payment. Dad called me that evening. She's lying. I was sitting at our dining table with Ethan halfway through dinner. I put my fork down. About what exactly? All of it. That isn't useful. She's telling people I approved this. Did you? No. Then tell your attorney that. I did. He sounded offended that I was not angrier on his behalf. She's using my messages, he said. Things I sent her when I was telling her to handle Reed business. I know. She knows what I meant. Probably. Probably? I looked at Ethan, who was deliberately staring at his plate. Dad, you spent years telling everyone that verbal understanding and trust were good enough. Now you have a dispute about what your words meant. That does not make her right. I didn't say it did. She's trying to make me look like I was part of this. I heard the fear beneath the anger then. For the first time, Chelsea was not merely threatening Dad's business. She was threatening his position in the story. Until that point, Robert Reed could still say he had been a betrayed father and careless owner. If Chelsea convinced anyone that he knowingly allowed the transfers, careless could become something much uglier. What do you want me to do? I asked. Tell them how I used those phrases. Who? Melissa. Counsel. Whoever needs to hear it. You should tell them. You know how I ran the company. So do they. You know I said whatever you need about everything. Staffing, vendors, freight, customer problems. Yes. Then say that. I leaned back in my chair. I'll answer factual questions if I'm asked. I'm not becoming your defense witness because Chelsea turned on you. He went silent. You know she's lying, he said. I know the evidence I've been shown does not establish that you specifically authorized Reed to pay Hearth and Vale expenses. That is not the same as me knowing everything that happened in every conversation between the two of you. Whose side are you on? I almost laughed. The side of what actually happened. He hung up less than a minute later. The following week, there was a meeting arranged through counsel. It was not a reconciliation dinner, and nobody pretended otherwise. We met in a conference room away from Reed's offices because company counsel did not want the discussion turned into a family spectacle in front of employees. Dad and Mom were there. I was there because some of the historical procedures Chelsea's attorney was relying on came from the period when I had been controller. Melissa joined for the factual portions. Chelsea attended with her attorney, and Ethan did not come because there was nothing for him to do except watch my family hurt each other. Chelsea looked different from the woman who had stood at my wedding 3 months earlier. Her face was thinner. The expensive confidence she used to wear so naturally had been replaced by something harder. She did not look broken. She looked cornered. Her attorney did most of the talking at first. He emphasized that Robert had repeatedly granted Chelsea broad operational discretion, allowed her to use treasury tools, signed authority documents, and encouraged her to solve cash and vendor problems. He described Hearth and Vale as a business Robert had supported from the beginning. He pointed to the informal nature of Reed's family management and argued that the absence of formal loan agreements did not prove the absence of authorization when the owner himself routinely operated without formal documentation. I understood why Dad was frightened. It was not a ridiculous argument. The same habits that had made Chelsea's actions easier to hide also made Dad's boundaries harder to prove. When her attorney finished, Dad leaned forward. I never told her she could take Reed money. Chelsea finally spoke. You told me to do whatever I needed. For Reed. You didn't always say that. You knew what I meant. You trusted me to make decisions. For this company. You gave me your key to make authorized payments. You signed access forms so you could do your job. Chelsea's expression barely changed. That's what I thought I was doing. Dad stared at her as though she had spoken another language. Your job was not paying your own company's bills. You helped Hearth and Vale from the beginning. I introduced you to vendors. You let me use Reed relationships. For introductions. You let me negotiate through Reed accounts. For Reed business. She leaned back slightly. You only call it stealing now because you're scared. Mom made a small sound beside him. Dad's face flushed. You framed your sister. Chelsea looked at me for the first time. That report is separate. I felt something cold move through me. Separate? Her attorney immediately said, We're not here to debate the report today. But Chelsea had already said it. Separate. As if manufacturing evidence against me existed in a different moral universe from the money she was trying to redefine as authorized. I kept my voice level. You added my name to a transaction report after the payment. Her attorney started to object again, but Melissa stepped in and said the forensic findings regarding the document had already been preserved and supplied through counsel. The meeting was not going to relitigate technical evidence. Chelsea looked away from me. Dad said, If I authorized everything, why did you put Samantha's name on it? Chelsea's attorney answered before she could. Our position is not that every subsequent action taken by my client was appropriate. We are discussing whether the underlying transfers were unauthorized. That was legally careful. Emotionally, it was brutal. Dad looked at Chelsea. So you admit you put her name there? Her attorney told her not to answer. For once, Dad had nothing to say. The silence gave me time to see the family differently. A few months earlier, I would have enjoyed watching Dad experience what he had done to me. Chelsea had created a document that made him feel trapped by a story he could not immediately disprove. There was an obvious symmetry in it. But the satisfaction did not last. I had no interest in protecting him from the consequences of his carelessness, and I had even less interest in helping Chelsea turn that carelessness into permission she might never have received. Dad had built the conditions. Chelsea appeared to have exploited them. Both things could be true. When the discussion turned to Robert's access delegations, I was asked how those permissions had historically functioned. I explained that broad system access was not the same thing as authority for every conceivable use. A finance employee could have credentials that technically allowed certain actions while still being restricted by company purpose, approval policy, or instructions. The problem at Reed was that those restrictions had often been verbal rather than documented. Dad interrupted. Because we trusted people. I looked at him. And now we are sitting here arguing about what trust meant. He frowned. Chelsea said, You hated when Samantha made everything formal. I hated unnecessary bureaucracy. You told everyone she made the company impossible to work in. Dad looked uncomfortable. She continued, You wanted me to be different. There was something true in that, too. He had. Chelsea had been rewarded for being easier than I was. She solved problems without making him read another procedure. She did not push back every time he wanted something done quickly. She made trust feel efficient. I had always thought that meant Dad loved her more. Sitting in that conference room, I realized something more complicated. Dad had loved what Chelsea allowed him to believe about himself. With me, every control weakness became a confrontation. With her, he got to remain the experienced founder whose judgment was enough. Then Chelsea used his judgment as her defense. Dad turned to me. You see what she's doing? I nodded. Yes. Then say something. What do you want me to say? That I did not authorize this. I wasn't there for your private conversations. His face hardened. You know me. That is exactly the kind of argument that created this problem. Whose side are you on? He asked again. I met his eyes. The side of what actually happened. This time he did not hang up because there was nowhere to go. Mom remained mostly quiet until the formal discussion ended. Chelsea and her attorney left first. I watched my sister gather her papers without looking at either of our parents. Dad did not say goodbye. Mom looked as if she might reach for Chelsea, then stopped herself. When the door closed, she turned to Dad. How could she do that to you? I almost answered before I realized she had not been talking to me. Dad stared at the table. Mom's anger finally surfaced. You defended her. You helped that business. You introduced her to everyone. And now she's telling people you told her to take the money? Dad said nothing. Then Mom looked at me. The shift happened so naturally that I almost admired it. Samantha, do something. I actually thought I had misunderstood her. What? You know how these records work. You know what happened. You need to fix this before it destroys the family. I stared at my mother. 3 months earlier, she had demanded police arrest me at my wedding. Now Chelsea had turned on Dad, and somehow my assignment had returned. What do you want me to fix? I asked. The records or the people? The family? No. Mom blinked. Samantha, I'll answer legitimate questions about systems I worked with. I'll complete the handoff I already agreed to. I'll provide any record I legally have that belongs to me. I am not fixing this family. You're just going to watch this happen? I didn't create it. But you can help. That sentence was so familiar it almost felt comforting. I stood and gathered my bag. Being able to help is not the same as being responsible for fixing it. Mom looked at Dad as if he might order me back into my old position. He did not. Maybe because he had already tried. For the next 2 weeks, Melissa and company counsel focused on a simple question that had somehow become more important than every emotional argument in that conference room. Before the wedding, before investigators, before Chelsea needed a defense, what had she told Dad about the transactions? If Robert knowingly authorized temporary advances, there should have been some evidence of that understanding in ordinary communications. It did not have to be a formal loan agreement. It could have been an email referring to repayment, a message saying Hearth and Vale needed short-term help, a discussion about an advance. Anything showing Dad knew Reed money was covering Chelsea's company. The vague messages proved he gave her discretion. They did not prove what he knew she was doing with it. Dad searched his own memory and remembered an argument over an invoice a few weeks before the wedding. He could not remember which supplier. He only remembered noticing something odd while reviewing expenses and asking Chelsea about it. That was not evidence. For once, even Dad understood that. Company counsel requested the archived email thread. While they were looking, Chelsea's side continued pressing the authorization narrative. Her attorney pointed out that Dad's signature appeared on delegation forms and that he had allowed a family business culture without formal intercompany agreements. The implication was obvious. If Robert wanted formal boundaries, he should have created them. I could not entirely disagree. The thing Chelsea's argument ignored was that weak boundaries did not automatically become permission to lie. That distinction mattered even more when Melissa called me near the end of February. We found the email Robert remembered. I was in my home office. I stopped typing. What did he ask? Melissa reminded me that the communication was company evidence and that I was receiving the relevant portion because it directly affected the factual history I had been asked to help clarify. Then she read the exchange. About a month before the wedding, Dad had emailed Chelsea about a supplier invoice that looked unusual to him. His message was short. Is this a Reed expense? Chelsea replied the same afternoon. Yes, it's ours. Nothing to do with Hearth and Vale. I read the wording again when counsel later provided the relevant excerpt. Nothing to do with Hearth and Vale. Not. Yes. This is one of the advances we discussed. Not, I used Reed temporarily and will reimburse it. Not, this is related to both businesses. Nothing to do with Hearth and Vale. Dad had asked the exact question Chelsea's defense now depended on. Before anyone accused her of theft, before she needed to protect herself, she had given him an answer that contradicted the story she was telling now. I called Ethan after Melissa's update. This is bad for her. He asked what had happened. I read him the exchange. So Dad asked directly? Yes. And she told him it had nothing to do with her company. Yes. That sounds important. It is. But? He knew me well. But it's one email. You're learning. I hate you. He laughed. I explained that the message weakened Chelsea's defense, but one denial about one invoice did not automatically prove Dad had been ignorant about every transaction over 2 years. Her attorney could still argue that some expenses were authorized and others were not, or that their understanding changed over time. The investigation needed the pattern. It always came back to the pattern. That afternoon, Dad called. This time, he did not sound angry. You saw the email? The relevant part. She lied to me. Yes. He waited, perhaps expecting comfort. I did not know what to give him. I asked her directly. I know. She looked me in the face later and said I knew. I know. I trusted her. That sentence finally broke through some of my anger. Not because it excused him, because he sounded old. You did, I said. And now everybody acts like that makes this my fault. Some of it is your fault. The softness vanished from his voice. Excuse me? You did not authorize her to lie to you. You did not authorize her to frame me. But you created the access culture she used. You ignored the warnings. Both things are true. I'm the victim here. You're one of them. He did not like that. Neither had I. For months, I had wanted a clean moral diagram. Chelsea guilty. Samantha innocent. Robert wrong. Diane enabling. But real responsibility did not divide itself neatly enough for family arguments. Dad had been betrayed by Chelsea and had betrayed me. Mom had not stolen but had concealed. Martin had not conspired but had violated controls and lied. I had done nothing financially wrong but had spent years using competence as permission to be cruel. Truth did not need everyone to fit into one category. Melissa called again several days later. Her team had found another communication in the vendor material that had already been preserved. She was careful about what she told me because the supplier's copy was still being matched against the version recovered from company data. The message appeared to be a billing instruction connected to one of the transactions where Reed had been billed while the shipment or service benefited Hearth and Vale. The wording was more explicit than anything we had seen before. Not a confession. Not yet authenticated enough for Melissa to treat it as final. But explicit. What does it say? I asked. I don't want you repeating the exact language until we've confirmed both sides. Then why tell me? Because counsel may need you to clarify whether that kind of billing structure ever existed when you were controller. It didn't. I know what you remember. We'll ask formally. I waited. Can you at least tell me what the issue is? Melissa paused. The instruction tells the vendor to bill through the Reed account and not reference Hearth and Vale on the invoice. My hand went still on the desk. Who sent it? The record we have appears associated with Chelsea. We are authenticating it against the supplier's retained copy. Did the supplier know it was unauthorized? We have no evidence of that. From their side, it may have looked like an approved related company billing arrangement. That mattered. The vendor was not the villain. Chelsea's instruction was. If authenticated, it would answer the question her new defense had created. It was one thing for Dad to give her broad permission to solve operational problems. It was another for Chelsea to direct a supplier to make an Hearth and Vale expense look like Reed's, then tell Dad separately that the expense had nothing to do with Hearth and Vale. Those two communications could not both fit comfortably inside the story she was telling now. I did not call Dad. I did not call Mom. I definitely did not call Chelsea. I closed my office door and sat quietly for a few minutes instead. The strangest thing about the investigation was how many times the truth changed shape without actually changing facts. At my wedding, the $50,000 looked like evidence against me. Then it looked like a vendor mistake. Then it looked like one desperate payment for Chelsea's failing business. Then the historical records turned it into a pattern. Chelsea's new defense tried to turn that pattern into something Dad had authorized. Now the records were asking a simpler question. If Dad knew, why had Chelsea told him the opposite? And somewhere in the evidence being authenticated was a message that might answer an even more dangerous one. Why had she told the vendor to hide Hearth and Vale's name? The message Melissa had warned me about was authenticated in March. The supplier still had its own copy, and the wording matched the record recovered from Chelsea's account closely enough that there was no longer a serious dispute about what she had sent. She had instructed the vendor to bill the charge under Reed Industrial Packaging's account and to use Reed's account name without referencing Hearth and Vale on the invoice. The supplier had not been told that anything was improper. From its perspective, Chelsea worked for Reed, had authority to communicate about the account, and appeared to be arranging billing between businesses connected through the same family. There was no evidence the supplier knew Robert had not approved the arrangement. The concealment was Chelsea's. That mattered because of the email Dad had sent her before the wedding. When he noticed one of the unusual expenses and asked whether it belonged to Reed, Chelsea had answered plainly, "Yes. It's ours. Nothing to do with Hearth and Vale." On one side, she was telling a vendor not to put Hearth and Vale's name on a Reed invoice. On the other, She was telling Dad that the same type of expense had nothing to do with Hearth and Vale. Those messages existed before police officers walked into my wedding, before investigators began asking questions, and before Chelsea needed a legal defense. She had not written them because someone was pressuring her to confess, or because attorneys were arguing over language. She had written them while she still believed the system was working for her. Melissa explained the evidence to me the way she always did, without giving any one document more power than it deserved. Reed had repeatedly paid obligations that benefited Hearth and Vale. Freight and warehouse services had gone to Chelsea's operation while appearing in Reed's books under descriptions that looked ordinary. Chelsea's bridge repayment spreadsheet tracked amounts Reed had paid as money. Hearth and Vale owed back, complete with dates by which she intended to replace it. Dad's authentication key explained how certain treasury approvals could be made, but not whether he had authorized a particular use. Martin's password explained why some accounting entries appeared under his username. Chelsea's laptop connected those misleading entries to her work environment. The report from my wedding had been edited after the transaction to add my name. And now, communications created before the scandal showed Chelsea concealing Hearth and Vale's connection from the same father she claimed had knowingly approved it. There was no single piece of paper labeled fraud. That was what made the truth harder to dismiss. Every attempt to explain one record created a problem with another. If the payments were merely accounting errors, why track them as amounts Hearth and Vale owed Reed? If Dad had knowingly approved advances, why tell him an expense had nothing to do with Hearth and Vale? If Dad understood the billing arrangement, why tell the supplier not to reference Hearth and Vale? If I had anything to do with the $50,000, why did my closed credentials never authorize it? And if all of this was legitimate family financing, why had someone needed to add my name to an internal report after the money moved? Melissa never asked me to answer those questions as an investigator. My role remained narrow. If counsel needed historical context about how systems had worked when I was controller, I provided it. If the detective needed confirmation about my own access or my offboarding records, I answered. I did not get to pronounce Chelsea guilty because she was my sister, and I understood spreadsheets. By then, I was grateful for that limitation. It kept the outcome from depending on whether anyone believed Samantha Reed. Chelsea called me directly for the first time in months near the end of March. I almost let it go to voicemail when I saw her name, but something told me she would not have bypassed the lawyers unless she wanted something the lawyers could not give her. "Can we talk without everyone else involved?" she asked. "That depends what you mean by talk." "I mean you and me." I stepped into my home office and closed the door. "Go ahead." For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Chelsea said, "Dad created this. Not I didn't do it. Not the records are wrong. Dad created this." "He created the access problems," I said. "That's already established." "He created all of it. He told me to handle things. He signed whatever I brought him. He let me use his key. Mom knew I had used Reed money before and helped me fix it. Everyone wants to pretend I woke up one morning and decided to rob them. You did not wake up one morning and create Reed's control failures." "Exactly. That does not answer whether you used them." Her voice sharpened. "You really need me to be the villain, don't you?" "No." "Yes, you do. You have needed this since the day I started Hearth and Vale. You told me it would fail. You treated me like a child playing business while you were the serious one. Now you finally get to prove it." I closed my eyes. Months earlier, that accusation would have sent me into a fight. This time I said, "You're right about one thing." Chelsea went silent. "I wanted to be right about you." She gave a small, humorless laugh. "At least you admit it. I wanted Dad to admit I understood the risks better than you did. I wanted him to admit the controls mattered. Sometimes I wanted Hearth and Vale to fail, because I hated the way everyone treated your confidence, like evidence you were more capable than me." Chelsea did not interrupt. "That was ugly," I continued. "It was also mine. I'm responsible for it." "Then help me." There it was. "With what?" "Tell them the truth." "I have." "No. Tell them how Dad ran things. Tell them these were family advances that got out of control. Tell them there was never some master plan to steal $287,000. I stared at the wall across from my desk. Did Dad know Reed was paying Hearth and Vale's bills? He knew I needed help. That isn't what I asked. He knew how I operated. Did he know those specific expenses belonged to Hearth and Vale? Chelsea exhaled sharply. Everything wasn't documented the way you want it to be. Did he know? You're doing the same thing you always do. Reducing people to yes or no boxes. No, I'm asking the question your defense depends on. She was quiet. I continued. Dad's negligence is real. Mom covering that earlier card charge was wrong. Martin sharing his password was wrong. Reed's controls were terrible. None of that becomes permission just because you put the facts in the same paragraph. Dad would have helped me if I had asked. Maybe. He gave me everything I needed. Access is not authorization. He'll survive this. I almost laughed at the sudden change. So that's the standard now? What? If Dad survives, it wasn't theft? That isn't what I said. You want me to tell investigators these were family loans. They were supposed to be paid back. Your spreadsheet proves you knew Hearth and Vale owed Reed money. It does not prove Dad agreed to lend it. I was going to replace every dollar. Then why did you tell him the expense had nothing to do with Hearth and Vale? Silence. And why did you tell the supplier not to put Hearth and Vale on the Reed invoice? Chelsea's breathing changed. I did not know whether her lawyer had told her that message had been fully authenticated yet. Apparently now she knew. You have no idea what it was like, she said. Every month something else was due. Ads, inventory, returns, warehouse fees, suppliers, employees. Dad kept telling everyone how proud he was. Mom told every person she knew that I had built this amazing business. You think I could just walk into dinner and announce I had failed? Yes. She laughed bitterly. I couldn't. That does not make Reed's money yours. No, Samantha. Of course you could say that. You walked away. You left Reed when Dad wouldn't do things your way, and everyone called you principled for it. Dad called me selfish for years. You still gotta leave. That stopped me. For the first time, I heard something underneath Chelsea's anger that was not simply rivalry. She had built an identity around staying. I was the daughter who walked out. Chelsea was the daughter who remained beside Dad, handled problems, supported Mom, and built a business of her own, while still helping the family company. Once Hearth and Vale began failing, admitting it would not only mean losing money. It would mean losing the role she had spent years proving she deserved. I understood it. I did not excuse it. Chelsea, I said, yes, I wanted to be right about you. That's exactly why I'm not asking anyone to take my word for it. I'm asking them to read yours. She did not answer. I am not going to tell anyone Dad authorized something when the records show you hid the connection from him. So that's it? That's it. You get your perfect ending. No. My voice surprised even me with how calm it sounded. I get my name back. Whatever happens to you after that comes from what you did, not what I wanted. Chelsea hung up. I sat in the office for another 10 minutes before I went downstairs. Ethan looked up from the kitchen table when he saw my face. She called. What did she want? For me to call the money family loans. Are you going to? No. He nodded. I waited for him to say something reassuring, but instead he asked, How do you feel? I thought about it. Sad. That was the truth. By April, Reed's financial position had begun stabilizing. The outside controller was in place. Treasury approvals were being handled under the new procedures. The lender kept the revolving line available under the remediation plan, although with reporting requirements Dad complained about constantly. Hearth and Vale was moving in the opposite direction. Suppliers tightened terms, financing options disappeared, and the business began formally winding down. Inventory and other recoverable assets were being sold, and whatever value could be recovered would eventually reduce Reed's verified loss. The collapse was not a single dramatic day. It was boxes leaving a warehouse, contracts ending, employees moving on, and a brand Chelsea had spent years building shrinking into numbers on a liquidation schedule. During that same period, company counsel raised a separate issue with my parents. My accusation. By then, nobody involved in the review had a legitimate basis to claim I had authorized the $50,000 transfer. My credentials had been closed. My hardware key had been returned years earlier. The bank authentication trail pointed elsewhere. The report Dad carried into the reception had been altered after the payment to add my name. Yet the original accusation had been made in front of our wedding guests and repeated to police. Dad and Mom had also told several relatives afterward that they believed I had stolen from Reed. Counsel advised them to correct the record in writing. Not because I demanded a public humiliation campaign, because leaving a false accusation circulating after the company itself had verified it was false created unnecessary legal and reputational risk and left Reed's own record inconsistent with the facts established by the investigation. Dad hated the idea. Mom hated it more. They asked to meet me at their house in April. I almost declined, then agreed because I wanted one thing settled cleanly. Dad had a draft prepared when I arrived. It said there had been a misunderstanding regarding a disputed transaction at my wedding, and that later information indicated I was not responsible. I read it once and placed it on the table. No, Dad's face tightened. What is wrong with it? It makes it sound like everyone misunderstood the same thing. That's what happened. No, you accused me, based on information we had. False information. We didn't know it was false. You did not verify it. Mom interrupted. How many times does your father have to say he made a mistake? This is not about how many times he says it to me. What do you want? She asked. A correction. That is a correction. No. It says there was a misunderstanding. There wasn't. Dad told people I stole $50,000. You told police to arrest me. That accusation was false. Mom looked at Dad. He rubbed his forehead. You want me to humiliate myself in front of 200 people. I almost smiled at the irony, but I did not. I want you to correct the lie in front of the people who heard it. It wasn't a lie if I believed it. The accusation was false whether you believed it or not. Dad looked away. I continued. I'm not asking you to describe Chelsea's case. I'm not asking you to confess to negligence. I'm not asking you to apologize publicly for every decision you made. I want one narrow statement. Samantha did not take the money. The report used to accuse her was altered. We were wrong to accuse her. Mom's eyes filled. Chelsea has already lost everything. I stared at her. This is not punishment for Chelsea. You know what sending that will do. What? Everyone will understand it was her. They already know there is an investigation. You could let this end. I leaned back. Correcting a false accusation against me is not doing something else to Chelsea. Mom whispered my name. I stopped her. No, you don't get to use what she has lost as a reason I have to keep carrying what she did to me. Dad looked at the draft again. What if I send it only to the family? No. Some of the guests barely know us. They heard the accusation. He shook his head. This is vindictive. I thought about that for a moment before answering. If I wanted revenge, I could post everything I know online. I could tell every customer, vendor, relative, and employee what happened. I haven't. I want the false statement corrected where you made it and where you repeated it. That's all. Company counsel had already told them substantially the same thing. That was why Dad finally stopped arguing. The correction went out several days later to the wedding guests whose contact information they had and to relatives and others my parents had personally told afterward. It was short. It did not contain Chelsea's financial details. It did not call her a thief. It said that the accusation made against me at my wedding had been incorrect. That verified banking and forensic records showed I had not initiated the transaction, and that the internal report used to accuse me had been altered after the transaction. Dad and Mom acknowledged that they should not have accused me before verifying the information. I read it once. Then I archived it. I did not forward it to anyone with a victory message. I did not post a screenshot. For months I had imagined how it would feel to see my parents publicly admit they were wrong. Mostly, it felt quiet. A few wedding guests wrote to me. Some apologized for assuming there had been truth behind the accusation. Others simply said they were glad the record had been corrected. I thanked them and moved on. That was enough. In May, Dad tried one last time to turn Reed into my reward. The company had stabilized enough that he was thinking beyond the immediate crisis. He asked me to lunch and spent the first half hour talking about the new controller, the lender, and the changes being made. Then he told me there would eventually be an executive role available if I wanted it. He spoke about authority, succession, and even the possibility of a future ownership interest. 3 years earlier, the offer would have reached straight into every wound I carried. Respect, power, proof, a seat nobody could tell me I had not earned. I listened until he finished. Then I said no. Dad stared at me. You haven't even asked what the ownership piece would look like. I don't need to. You said you wanted authority. I did when I worked here. You'd have it now. I don't want it now. His expression shifted from confusion to irritation. So what was all of this for? The question stunned me. All of what? The controls, the arguing, the years of telling me how the company should run. Now it's finally running the way you wanted and you don't want it? I understood then that Dad still thought the prize had always been Reed. It was never about getting your company. Then what was it about? Being allowed to do my job without being responsible for everyone else's choices. He looked down at the table. I reminded him that my historical handoff had an end date already agreed to in writing. I would finish it. I would answer the final process questions. After that, Reed had an outside controller and professional advisors. You need a controller, I told him. That is not the same as needing me. He did not argue. Maybe he finally understood. Maybe he was too tired. Either way, I left lunch without the job, without the ownership promise, and without regret. By June, the forensic loss schedule was nearing completion. Recoveries, reimbursements, and liquidation proceeds were credited where appropriate, so the final number would not pretend Reed had lost money it had actually recovered. The authenticated supplier message, Chelsea's earlier denial to Dad, the altered report history, the bank authentication records, Key 14, the bridge repayment sheet, the device activity, and the verified vendor payment pattern were all preserved as part of the continuing case. That was not the first time law enforcement saw the evidence. The detective had been receiving supplemental material since December, and the matter had already moved into financial crimes and prosecutor review. By spring, Chelsea had criminal defense counsel dealing with formal charging discussions, while Melissa finished the forensic schedule. The final documents did not suddenly create a case in June. They closed the remaining gaps in one that had been building for months. Mom occasionally called to tell me Chelsea was frightened. I believed her. Dad called less often. When he did, he no longer asked me to fix Reed. That was progress. In late June, my attorney called after receiving an update through the proper channels. Chelsea's lawyer had entered plea negotiations, and the parties had reached a framework that would be presented through the court process in July. There were still details to finalize. Sentencing had not happened. No one had magically transformed months of records into a 5-minute punishment. I thanked him and ended the call. Then I went outside. Ethan was trimming a hedge near the back patio, wearing an old t-shirt, and looking nothing like the man whose wedding reception had been invaded by my family 7 months earlier. He switched off the trimmer when he saw me. News? I nodded. Plea talks. He waited. I walked over and stood beside him. For most of my life, I thought revenge would feel like someone else finally hurting as much as I had. It didn't. The satisfying part was much quieter. My name had been corrected. Reed no longer depended on me. Dad was living under the controls he once mocked. Mom could no longer call what happened at my wedding a misunderstanding, and Chelsea's fate was now being determined by records she created herself, not by how persuasive I could be. By the end of June, the evidence was no longer waiting to become a case. Chelsea's lawyer had agreed to the framework of a plea, and the court had put July on the calendar. Chelsea entered her guilty plea on Thursday, July 2nd. I did not sit in the courtroom waiting for some cinematic moment when my sister finally looked at me and admitted everything. By then, I had learned that real consequences rarely arranged themselves for emotional convenience. Her lawyer had spent months reviewing the bank records, the forensic findings, the vendor communications, the altered report, and the final loss schedule. The prosecutor had spent months doing the same. Amounts recovered through reimbursements, liquidation, and the sale of Hearth and Veil inventory had been credited rather than ignored, so nobody could pretend Reed had lost money. It had actually gotten back. What remained was enough that Chelsea was pleading guilty to a serious financial theft offense, and everyone involved understood that sentencing would not be a slap on the wrist. My attorney explained the outcome to me in ordinary language, rather than turning our conversation into a lecture about criminal statutes. Chelsea had admitted criminal responsibility under the negotiated agreement. Restitution would be based on the verified unrecovered loss. Her position at Reed was permanently gone. Hearth and Vale was already being dismantled, not because a judge had waved a hand and destroyed it in a day, but because months of lost credit, supplier pressure, liquidation, and the investigation had left the business with no realistic path forward. Sentencing was scheduled for July 17th. That gave my mother 2 weeks to decide I was responsible for saving Chelsea one last time. Mom called 4 days before sentencing and asked if she could come over. I told her we could meet for coffee instead. She did not argue, which told me before we sat down that she wanted something. She arrived carrying a folder but left it closed beside her purse while we ordered. For the first several minutes, she talked about things that did not matter. The weather. A cousin I had not spoken to in years. Someone from church asking how the family was doing. Then she placed both hands around her coffee cup and said, "Her lawyer says character letters can matter." I waited. "Samantha, she is your sister. I know. She did something terrible. I'm not denying that anymore." That sentence alone would have been unimaginable 9 months earlier. Mom continued. But she was under enormous pressure. Hearth and Vale was collapsing. She kept telling herself she could replace the money. She never meant for any of this to become as big as it did. I looked at her. "Did Chelsea ask you to talk to me?" "No." I waited again. Mom looked away. "Her lawyer mentioned family letters, so you decided I should write one. I think it would mean something coming from you." It would. Hope appeared in her face too quickly. "That's why I'm not doing it." Her expression changed. "Why would you say that?" "Because a letter from me would carry weight precisely because she framed me. You don't have to say she's innocent. I know. You could say she was under pressure. You could say she has a family that cares about her. You could say you don't want her punished harshly." I put my coffee down. "I am not asking for harsh punishment." "Then write that. If anyone asks me for a statement, I will tell the truth. I'll say I don't want extra punishment because I'm angry. I'll also say she deliberately put my name on a report after moving money. And that accusation brought police into my wedding." Mom's eyes filled. "She's already lost her business. That is a consequence of what happened. She's lost her career. Yes, she could lose 1.5 years of her life." I studied my mother for a moment. "No, she will still be alive for those 18 months. She will still have choices afterward. What she is losing is freedom because of a sentence based on what she admitted doing." Mom flinched. I did not enjoy saying it. That was something I noticed about myself by then. 9 months earlier, hurting someone with a correct sentence could make me feel powerful. By July, I had stopped mistaking pain for proof that I had won. Mom opened the folder. Inside was a draft someone had apparently suggested she use as a model. I did not read it. "I can't do this for you. I'm asking you to do it for Chelsea. That is the same problem." Mom stared at me. I leaned forward. "I am not asking anyone to punish her more. I'm just not going to lie to punish her less. I didn't ask you to lie. You asked me to emphasize the parts that make her easier to forgive and minimize the parts that made me her victim. That isn't fair. It is exactly what you did when you covered the company card charge. You looked at the part where she was scared and decided the consequence needed to become someone else's responsibility." Mom lowered her eyes. I softened my voice, but not the answer. "I'm not doing that anymore." She put the draft back into the folder and closed it. We finished our coffee without another argument. When she left, she hugged me. I hugged her back. A boundary did not require me to stop loving my mother. It required me to stop treating love as an instruction to obey her. Chelsea was sentenced on Friday, July 17th, 18 months. Restitution on the verified loss that remained after recoveries were credited, followed by the supervision required under the sentence. I did not ask for the maximum available punishment. I did not submit a letter begging for leniency. I provided factual information when it was requested, and let the court handle the part that belonged to the court. I saw Chelsea that day. She looked smaller than she had at the wedding, though I knew some of that was probably because I no longer saw her through the old family hierarchy. For most of our lives, Chelsea had somehow occupied more emotional space than anyone else in the room. Her happiness changed dinner plans. Her panic created emergencies. Her business became a family project. Her mistakes turned into problems the rest of us had to solve. That day, nobody could solve this one for her. She looked at me once before the proceedings ended. I did not know what she was thinking, and I no longer needed to invent it. I knew what I was thinking. I wished she had asked for help 2 years earlier. Real help, not access, not money, not a quiet bailout from Mom, not another month purchased with someone else's account. If Chelsea had walked into Dad's office and said Hearth and Vale was failing, the conversation might have been humiliating. Dad might have been angry. Mom might have cried. I might even have said something sharper than I should have. But nobody would have gone to prison because a business failed. Failure had never been the thing that destroyed Chelsea. The things she did to avoid admitting it had. Dad asked me to meet him the next morning. For once, he did not choose Reed. We met at a small breakfast place where nobody treated him like the founder of anything. He looked tired, but not defeated. The company was surviving. Customers had not disappeared. Employees were being paid. The revolving line remained available under the lender's conditions. What had changed was Dad's freedom to run the financial side of Reed entirely through instinct. There was now an outside controller. Large treasury payments required dual authorization. Vendor setup required documentation. Accounting passwords belonged to the person assigned to them. Hardware keys were tracked. Access reviews actually happened. The lender received periodic reporting. Dad had once called those things red tape. Now they were simply how Reed operated. I met with the controller yesterday, he said after our food arrived. How's that going? He asks too many questions. I smiled. Dad noticed. Don't. I didn't say anything. You didn't have to. He cut into his breakfast and shook his head. For the first time, there was something almost normal between us. Then he put his fork down. I owe you an apology. I stayed quiet. I should never have called police before verifying that report. The specificity mattered. He did not say mistakes were made. He did not say emotions were high. He did not say Chelsea fooled everyone as if he had been a passenger in his own decisions. I saw your name and I believed the worst version of you because I was still angry that you left Reed. I looked at him. He continued. I thought you abandoned the family. Then I saw that report and it fit what I already wanted to believe. I should have checked. I didn't. Thank you. He seemed surprised. That's all? What did you expect? I don't know. You apologized for something specific. I accepted the apology. His face tightened slightly. Does that mean we're okay? No. That hurt him. Ilatit. Not every pain needed fixing. An apology matters, I said. It doesn't erase what happened. Trust comes after behavior. How long? I don't know. Dad looked down at his plate. A year earlier, I would have tried to make that easier for him. I might have promised things I was not ready to promise because his discomfort would have felt like another problem I knew how to solve. Instead, I ate breakfast. Before we left, Dad said something about how much Reed had changed. I asked whether he regretted accepting the outside controller. Yes, I laughed. He did too. Then he added, and no, that was probably the most growth I was going to get from Robert Reed in one breakfast. Mom's consequence looked different. There was no court order forcing Diane Reed to examine the way she protected Chelsea. There was no regulator assigned to monitor whether she used guilt correctly. She had to live with something harder to quantify. The written correction my parents had sent, after falsely accusing me, remained out there. She could not tell relatives the wedding had simply been a misunderstanding without someone remembering that she and Dad had formally acknowledged I had not taken the money. She also knew exactly what she had done the previous March. She had seen a Reed Company charge tied to Hearth and Vale. Chelsea had panicked. Mom had provided the money that allowed her to reimburse it quietly. She had called that love. Months later, she finally admitted to me that she sometimes wondered whether making that first problem disappear had taught Chelsea the wrong lesson. "I thought I was helping her fix a mistake," she said during one of our phone calls. "You were." Mom sounded confused. "You did help her fix that one charge," I continued. "The problem is that you also helped her avoid what should have happened after it." "What?" Someone asking why it happened. She did not argue. That was new. Our contact remained limited. If a phone call turned into "Chelsea needs you," or "your father needs you," or "the family needs you to make peace," I ended it. Not dramatically. I simply said I was not discussing that and changed the subject or got off the phone. Mom learned eventually, or at least she learned I meant it. Martin Keller faced consequences too. Reed disciplined him for sharing his accounting password and for lying about it when the review began. He was not prosecuted because the evidence did not show that he had stolen money or knowingly helped Chelsea steal it. He moved out of his old role and into a shortened transition toward retirement. I heard from him once through a brief email. He wrote, "You were right about the passwords." I stared at that sentence longer than it deserved. Then I replied, "We were all too casual about things that mattered." It was not absolution. It was also not the victory lap I once would have taken. Most importantly, Reed's employees kept getting paid without me returning as controller or writing a check from my own account. The new financial structure, tighter management, lender cooperation, and the company's actual operating revenue carried the business through the crisis. Some vendor relationships had to be repaired. Spending was tightened. The missing money hurt, but the company survived. That mattered because it proved something I had needed to learn. Helping did not require taking over. My limited handoff ended the week before Chelsea was sentenced. I answered one final question from the outside controller about how an old vendor approval archive had been organized. I sent a short, factual response, received confirmation that nothing further was needed, and saved the handoff complete email. Then I closed the folder. No title, no equity, no executive office, no secret reward from Dad for being the daughter who had been right. Just done. 3 days after Chelsea's sentencing, Ethan and I finally left for our honeymoon. We had delayed it for more than 8 months, and by July 20th I was almost afraid to go. Not because anything required me to stay. Nothing did. That was the problem. For years, being needed had been one of the ways I understood my own value. There was always a report to review, a parent to calm down, an employee to help, a sister to argue with, a family problem waiting for the person everyone trusted to be competent. The night before our flight, I checked my work email twice after getting into bed. Ethan looked at me. "What?" "You know nobody from Reed is going to call you." "I know, and if they do, they have a controller." He smiled. I hated how proud of myself I felt saying it. We left on July 20th and came home 10 days later. I will not pretend the trip transformed me into a person who suddenly understood relaxation. The first 2 days, I checked my phone too often. On the third, I left it in the hotel room while Ethan and I went to breakfast. Nothing collapsed. By the 5th day, I went almost an entire afternoon without wondering whether Dad had argued with the new controller. Nothing collapsed then either. We talked about our marriage instead of my family. We talked about places we wanted to visit, changes Ethan was considering at work, and whether we wanted to repaint the room that still contained several wedding gifts we had never properly organized. We talked about ordinary married things. Ordinary felt luxurious. We returned to Columbus on July 30th. Today is August 11th, a little more than 9 months since I stood in a wedding dress and heard my father tell police I had stolen $50,000. Chelsea and I do not speak. Maybe that will change someday. Maybe it will not. I have stopped treating reconciliation as another project that becomes my responsibility simply because I know how to organize difficult things. I speak to Dad occasionally. I speak to Mom a little more often. The relationships are smaller than they once were, but they are also more honest. Neither of them gets automatic access to my life simply because we share a last name. Reed Industrial Packaging still exists. Dad still owns it. And every large payment still requires the controls he once called insulting. There is justice in that, though not the kind I imagined when I was angry. The final evidence from the case was never mine to keep. The bank records, forensic images, company memo, and investigative files belonged where they belonged. What I kept for myself was much simpler. My old offboarding confirmation, the written correction my parents sent after accusing me, and the final email confirming my temporary handoff to Reed was complete. 3 pieces of paper marking 3 different versions of me. The woman who left, the woman who cleared her name, the woman who finished helping and stopped. I put them in a folder in my home office and slid it into a drawer. Ethan appeared in the doorway while I was closing it. "We still going away this weekend?" We had planned 2 quiet nights outside the city. Nothing dramatic. Just the 2 of us. "Yes." He looked at my desk. "Are you bringing the laptop?" My hand moved toward it automatically. Then I stopped. For 9 months, almost every important turn in my life had arrived through a screen. Bank records, emails, messages, reports, evidence, requests to help, requests to forgive, requests to fix. I looked at Ethan. "No." He smiled. I left the laptop where it was. And this time, when I walked out of the room, I did not look back. When your family mistakes your strength for an obligation to rescue them, remember that competence does not make you responsible for consequences you did not create. Protect your name, tell the truth, help innocent people without sacrificing yourself, and let accountability do its work. Subscribe for stories about choosing yourself.